In 2010, a 17-year-old boy is devastated to find out that his father had suddenly passed away. And it really sent shockwaves through the whole family. Not only because now they're grieving the loss of their father, their husband, but because so much of their daily lives they spent together. I mean, this was a very close family, and one of the things that they liked to do as a family was they owned a cabin. It was around Mount Bachelor in Oregon, this beautiful mountain where you can go snowboarding and skiing. They had this family cabin up there where in the wintertime, this family would spend a lot of time there. They would go up there as a family, spend time there as a family. It was this wonderful retreat. And as they're trying to settle the estate of their husband, their father, they're trying to figure out what they want to do with this cabin, because all of a sudden this place that, used to bring them so much joy and was a place of very fond memories suddenly felt kind of hollow. It just would never be the same. And so they decided that they were actually going to sell this cabin. And the 17-year-old boy was just really upset about this. He was very close to his father. He had some very fond memories of going hunting and skiing and snowboarding with his dad at this cabin. And so once the cabin was actually put up for sale by this boy's mother, he asked if, before they actually sell it, could he spend some time up there, I guess paying his respects in a way to his father. But he just wanted one more opportunity to spend some time in that cabin. And his mom said, go for it, take as many days as you want, go up and hang out in the cabin. But when you come back, we are going to sell the place. So his father had actually willed to his son his vehicle. And so the 17-year-old boy loads up his father's car. He goes out and he buys some snacks and drinks, heads up to the cabin in Oregon with the family dog whose name was Midnight. And his plan was just to go up to this cabin and basically try to enjoy being in this space one last time. Don't think about it as this place that now has no meaning because his father had died, but rather a place that he wanted one last positive memory before it was forever gone from their family. And so he gets up there, makes his way to the cabin, and he settles in for what turned out to be an abbreviated stay at the cabin. So in order to understand this story, we need to talk a little bit about the layout of the cabin itself. The cabin was 2 stories, and it was built into a mountain, Mount Bachelor in Oregon. And so the back half of the cabin was kind of settled into the mountain. So there were no windows, save a little sliver of window that fed into the bathroom, actually, in the back of the cabin. The front of the cabin was this beautiful, double-decker cabin with, windows on the second floor that fed into the master bedroom. On the second floor, there was a walk-out balcony that kind of jutted out a few feet from the second deck. The first floor, you could see in through all these beautiful windows. There was a sitting area, like a living room and a TV, and then a small kitchen as well. So the cabin was built in an area that was heavily forested. So they had to clear out, a bunch of trees to even build this cabin when the family had this built years and years ago. And so they really only cleared away the front section of trees so that there was a clear shot to the house. But the sides and the back were very heavily forested with these huge tall pine trees. And they basically had this little tiny driveway that fed in through all the trees, and you had this one kind of clearing in front of the cabin. So if you were on the second floor of the cabin, where there's the master bedroom, there's a bed up there, and you were looking out that window, you'd be looking over the balcony out into a clearing, basically. But there's a tree line, 100 yards past that clearing that's very dense. And there's actually a couple of trees, fairly prominent trees, that are sitting in front of the cabin that they did not cut down. One of which, for the story, we'll call it the sitting tree. Parallel to the ground, about 20 feet up, was this beautiful branch that looked perfect for a whole bunch of people sitting on it. But it was 20 feet above the ground, and there wasn't really any way to climb up to it, and no one was trying to climb this tree. But there's this tree that basically has a seat, if you will. Like the branch is like a seat that is looking directly into the cabin. And that's going to matter later in the story. So clearing in front of the cabin with this one kind of sitting tree, and then a very dense forest 360 degrees beyond, that one clearing. So when the 17-year-old gets to the cabin, he goes inside, he puts his drinks in the fridge, puts his snacks on the counter, he hooks up his PlayStation to the TV, and he's just like having a great time. His dog Midnight is roaming around, enjoying being at the cabin, and he's having a great time. And over the course of the first 2 days that he was there, it was everything he hoped it would be. It was like he was bonding with his father one last time. It was a peaceful time that he was there. He was happy to be there. And he was just enjoying himself, eating snacks and playing video games for a couple of days. He actually left a couple times to go snowboarding too. But on the third day that he was there, things started to get pretty weird. So on the third day when he got up, it had snowed dramatically the night before. A couple of feet of snow on the ground, still snowing pretty heavily. And he's like, I just don't feel like brushing off my car and trying to go to the store or go to the slopes to go snowboarding. I'm just going to basically be shut in for the day. And he was excited about it. He's like, great, me and my dog Midnight can bomb around the inside and play some more video games and eat some more snacks and do whatever. Midday that day, Midnight needed to pee, so he went outside with Midnight and let Midnight run around and go to the bathroom. And while he's out there with his dog, he notices there are some footprints in the snow that looked relatively fresh. And this is the first time that he's left his cabin that day, so they aren't his. And his neighbors were pretty far away, and he figured that they were older, that they were probably not going to be trekking around the woods. So he's thinking to himself, I wonder who made these footprints. And he's looking at them, and they started in the woods. So the woods are not that far away from where he is. He's in a relatively small clearing just in front of his cabin. But he can tell these fresh footprints have come out of the woods. And they're basically right in front of this clearing. And he notices that they bank around and go to the back of his cabin and kind of go up onto the mountain. And he kind of just starts walking and following the footprints a bit, and they kind of disappear up onto the mountain behind his cabin. And he's not overly concerned or anything, but he definitely takes note that more than likely somebody was walking around his cabin. Maybe it was someone who got lost. Maybe it was a neighbor. I mean, he's rationalizing it. He's thinking, you know what? It can't have been anything too serious. Obviously, they didn't knock on my door. They didn't need anything. And so he kind of writes it off. So that night, he stays up late playing video games, and his dog is sleeping next to his chair. And at some point, he's tired and he wants to go to bed. So he draws all the curtains, so blackout curtains around the downstairs, shuts all the blinds, and locks all the windows, all the doors, and heads upstairs to the lofted second floor where the master bedroom is. He, gets in bed, turns off all the lights, everything's locked, everything's shut. The dog climbs into bed, and the dog would sleep up near his head. And suddenly the dog jumps up, still on the bed, and looks at the stairs leading downstairs to the front door. And its ears are perked up like it's heard something. And it wasn't unusual for the dog to be a little jumpy, maybe it heard something. He wasn't overtly concerned. But when Midnight, the dog, jumps off the bed and sprints downstairs after having this sudden alertness, and he's listening. Now he is a little bit worried. He's thinking, well, I saw footsteps yesterday walking around my cabin, and now it's the middle of the night, and my dog is downstairs acting like it's heard something. And he hears the dog, Midnight, pacing around the downstairs, like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Every indication is the dog wants to go outside. That's the noises that he's picking up that signal from the dog. And so finally, even though he's feeling a little bit unnerved by this, he decides to go down and see what Midnight wants. And so Midnight is by the door, ears perked up, very eager to go outside. It's pacing, and he thinks, you know what, she just needs to go to the bathroom. And so he opens the door with Midnight and he goes outside and he expects his dog to pee. But Midnight doesn't need to pee. Midnight starts kind of stalking around the corner and looking out across the clearing towards the sitting tree in that direction. And it just stops. And it's looking at something very intently, as if it spotted an animal or something in the woods. And so the boy is looking at the dog, and he's kind of trying to encourage the dog to do its business so they can go back in the cabin. And he's starting to feel really uncomfortable. He's looking around. He's thinking like, okay, I don't know what's going on. Like, I'm a little bit concerned now. And he's sensing that Midnight is going at some point to try to take off after whatever she sees in the woods. And so preemptively, he grabs Midnight and says, all right, drags Midnight back in the house and shuts the door and locks it and takes one last look out the window of the door and just kind of looks out. I mean, it's dark. He doesn't have a light or anything. And he's like, man, that's creepy. Locks it, shuts the blinds, confirms everything downstairs is locked, does a sanity check to make sure everything is locked, and goes back upstairs with Midnight. Midnight did not want to go back upstairs. He had to practically drag her back upstairs. And then when they did get back in bed, Midnight refused to get in bed, but instead stood next to the bed looking at the stairs, wanting to go downstairs, periodically looking back at him and then down at the stairs. Midnight wanted to go back outside. So he's laying there in bed and he's taking full stock of the fact that his dog is very much on edge, but he's trying to fall back asleep, trying to convince himself that nothing weird is going on. And after about 30 minutes of that and being unsuccessful at falling asleep, as he's laying there, it's silent, and all of a sudden he hears footsteps on his roof. Now, the roof is right above his head. I mean, he's on the second floor. There is no attic. The roof is right there. And he hears about 6 footsteps. And he actually described it as something with hooves. And his dog instantly looks up as well. And they're both watching the ceiling as what sounds like hooves walking along the roof of this cabin. And it was so distinctive that immediately what he's thinking to himself is, how could a deer or a moose or something get on the roof of the house? There is no way, unless you leapt from a tree or had a ladder, for you to get on the roof. And how did we not hear, if they leapt from a tree or a ladder even, how didn't we hear a loud slamming sound when they first landed on the roof? Like, it's as if they've been there for a while and we just didn't know. And so then the footsteps stop, and at this point the dog stops looking at the roof and goes right to the balcony, which is shut. There's a door shut to the balcony, and there's curtains drawn against the balcony, so he can't see what's out there. And so the 17-year-old boy is sitting in his bed, and he's like, oh, I don't want to see what's on the porch. And he even says in his write-up about this that he's like, I'm a pretty tough guy, but I am in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, totally isolated. Like, I almost don't want to know what's going on outside. I just want to pretend it's not happening. But at some point, he musters the courage to go out on the balcony. And so he walks over very timidly to the door, and midnight's there, ready to go outside. And he takes a deep breath and he slides open the blackout curtains. But there's no light outside and there's no light inside, so it's just kind of darkness. And he can barely make out even just the snow that's on the balcony right in front of him. And he takes a deep breath and he unlocks the door and he opens it up. And the first thing he does is he turns and he looks up at the roof to see if there's a deer or a moose or something on the roof. There's nothing up there, and he's kind of peering around, and he can't even see footprints up there. So in a way, he's kind of relieved, right? Like, I must have been imagining that. He had a flashlight, and so at this point, he's looking back at his roof of his cabin, and he shines the light real quick, and it's totally dark out, right? So this light goes very far, and he sees nothing. And the dog at this point, he can hear the dog making kind of some commotion below him. It's angling itself to look out in the direction of the sitting tree and out towards that tree line where the dog had originally been fixated on something in the tree line. And so, just doing his diligence, the 17-year-old scans from the top of the roof where he sees nothing. He starts scanning over to the side of the house, right? Like, this is the direction of the sitting tree. He's looking over here, and he's scanning the tree line, just looking for anything that might have been on the roof. And he's looking, and he's looking, and he's looking, and then he gets to the sitting tree. And his flashlight stops on a man crouched on that perch, 20 feet off the ground on the sitting tree, who looked very tall. He had his hands holding onto the branch right above him, and his mouth is open. And he's holding onto the branch, and he's looking directly at the boy, unblinking, 100% focused on him. He's less than 50 yards away from him at this point. And it took him a second, the 17-year-old, to register what his flashlight was pointed at. And he panics and he drops it. And the dog reacts to the drop flashlight too. And because he's alone out here, he needs to protect himself. So he scoops that light back up and he shines it one more time to see, like, holy cow, like, what did I just see? And the guy on the branch is now gone. And he scans the ground. There's nothing. And he's terrified at this point. So he grabs his dog, throws Midnight back into the cabin, runs back in, shuts the door, locks it, closes the blinds, turns off his light, and literally gets back in bed with his dog. And he's now basically cowering on the bed. So at this point, they're sitting on the bed. Midnight is no longer acting like she wants to go outside. I think she's picking up potentially on the paranoia. Okay. At this point, the boy and his dog are sitting on the bed, and they're both scared at this point. Midnight, was fearsome while she was outside, but now that she's back inside, she doesn't want to go near the door either. She's rubbing up against him. She doesn't want to go anywhere. And they're sitting there, and the boy, all he's thinking to himself is, did I really just see that? It looked like an unnaturally tall man. How did he get in the tree? That's 20 feet off the ground. There's no way to get up into the tree. And why was it sitting there with its mouth open, staring at me? And who was on the roof? Was anything on the roof? And if this thing can get 20 feet up into a tree, it certainly can get on the roof of my cabin, I would imagine. But what was it? So he's having this type of thought process, and he's realizing too that it's not that late in the night. He still has hours until the sun's going to come up. And as he's basically panicking and feeding off his own paranoia, and it's getting worse and worse by the second, he hears tapping on the door, on the front door of his cabin. And his heart sinks, and he and his dog kind of look in the direction of the tapping, and he knows he's not going to go open the door. He knows the door is locked. He knows everything is locked. He's panicking that maybe it wasn't, but he knows he locked it. And the tapping just sounds like a finger tapping on the window. And at some point the tapping stops, and he thinks, okay, maybe they'll just go away. And then he hears what sounds like footsteps outside, and then tapping begins on the side of his cabin. Not the front door anymore, like the wall of the cabin. Now it's a little bit louder. The tapping continues up the side of the house, and then it stops. And he's sitting there and he's thinking, whatever this is walking around my cabin. And then he hears tapping on the little slit that is the window that feeds into the bathroom that's right behind the bedroom that he's in right now. So 6 feet away, maybe 10 feet away, whatever this thing is, it's now literally just a small pane of glass away, tapping on the glass. And so now he's petrified. And he's just hoping that this thing goes away. It doesn't. It goes to the other side of the cabin and starts tapping on the wall on the other side of the cabin and makes it all the way back to the front, where it begins tapping on the glass of the front window, back to the door. And he's just thinking, like, whatever this is walking around my cabin, tapping all over my cabin. And then all the tapping stops. And his heart's racing. You know, it's the middle of the night. He's in the middle of the woods somewhere. He's totally isolated. And then it's like his worst nightmare comes true. He hears footsteps on his balcony, and then tapping right on the big sliding glass doors of the door leading out to the balcony. And he knows that right behind a blackout curtain and a pane of glass is this tall man, more than likely, who's right on his balcony. And the tapping on the balcony goes on and on and on. And then all of a sudden it stops. And he's just waiting for it to open the door and come inside. But it doesn't. Instead, it goes on the roof, and it starts tapping on the roof directly above him. And the tapping continues all night. And so finally the sun comes up. You know, he hasn't slept all night, and he finally gets the courage to go over to the balcony and open up the curtains and see what's out there. And when he does, there is nothing out there, but there's footprints, as if someone had been pacing on the balcony all night. He opens it up and he finally just jumps out and looks up on his roof. There's nothing on his roof. He can see all these footprints on his roof. He looks down, and it's like a racetrack of footprints all around his house. Someone had been basically stalking his house all night, and then the footsteps retreat all the way to the sitting tree and then go back into the woods. He packed up his stuff, he left, and he couldn't have been happier that the family sold that cabin, because he was never going to go back. So to this day, he has no idea what it was. And even if it was just a person who was tapping on your windows and your walls and your roof and your balcony, even if it was just a human being doing that, that would be horrifying. Let alone if it was something else, something paranormal. Before Herb Baumeister would become a prolific, horrible serial killer, he was a pillar of his community. He was a doting father. He was a loving husband. His neighbors enjoyed spending time with him because he was high energy and he threw great parties. But what people didn't know from outward appearances is that he was schizophrenic and had been diagnosed at a young age. He also had this deep obsession with death and dying that he could never quite shake. His morbid obsession would ultimately take over, and he would go on to end the lives of nearly 24 young men in Indiana, and he would bury the majority of them on his property, which was known as Fox Hollow Farm. When an investigation into all these missing young men in Indiana points at Herb Baumeister being the primary suspect, Baumeister flees his property and ultimately ends his own life. And in the note he leaves, he just says that the reason he's taking his own life is because his business is failing, and so is his marriage. He doesn't confess to any of the murders. He doesn't give investigators any indication of how many people he killed or where they are. He didn't give any closure to anyone. He just took his own life, and that was that. And so while investigators did a very thorough search of the property that Baumeister owned, the Fox Hollow Farms property, and found over 5,000 human bone fragments and were able to identify a number of victims, they believe that there are more victims buried at Fox Hollow Farms that we may never uncover. So our story picks up over a decade later when two new owners come in, purchase Fox Hollow Farms, and almost immediately some very strange things start happening in and around the property. Then they record this very famous audio recording inside the property, which that in conjunction with the other strange things that they had seen around the property leads them to believe that Fox Hollow Farms is haunted. So before we get into their story and we listen to that audio recording, if you're interested in strange, dark, and mysterious content like what I'm promising on today's episode, then you've come to the right place, because this is the type of content that I produce 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that interests you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these uploads every week. So let's dive in. In 2006, Rob, Vicky Graves, and their 2 teenage sons were tired of living the city, fast-paced lifestyle and decided to look for some property in suburban Indiana where they could kind of escape that busy lifestyle. And so when they were looking at real estate in some of the nicer suburbs of Indiana, they found this one property called Fox Hollow Farms that was this huge, sprawling estate, but was selling for some unbelievably cheap price. And so they contact a real estate agent who says, yeah, we'd love to give you a tour of the place. It's up for sale. No one's occupying it right now. It's owned by an investor, but they are looking to sell, obviously. So yeah, let's do a house tour. And so they're open-minded. It seems too good to be true, but they decide, you know what, we'll go take a look. And so they get to this property, and it's beautiful. It is everything they wanted this dream home they're looking for to be. You know, it has an indoor swimming pool. It's got loads of bedrooms and bathrooms. It's like basically a mansion. And as they're walking around the property, Rob is speaking to his wife, Vicky, and they're both kind of going back and forth like, what's wrong with this place? This doesn't make any sense. Rob starts to wonder, wait a second. I think I've heard of this place on TV before. And he's having like an epiphany. And he's like, I think that this could actually be the home of one of the most notorious serial killers in Indiana's history, Herb Baumeister. It's like it just came to him that the name Fox Hollow Farm was something he remembered hearing on TV. And so he stops the real estate agent on their tour and he says, hey, this is a beautiful home, but is this the home of Herb Baumeister? And the real estate agent, almost expecting this to be brought up, was like, yes, that's why it's still on the market. People are unwilling to purchase this home, even though the investor who scooped this up in the 90s, following the tragedy that was the Herb Baumeister case, the investor had basically gutted the whole residence and basically removed all the kind of remnants of what it used to look like when Herb Baumeister was living there. Nobody wanted it because, you know, Herb Baumeister had killed nearly 24 young men and buried them on the property, and investigators still were finding pieces of bone on the property. And they didn't really know how many victims there were. And so it was this kind of spooky place to live. And so the real estate agent just said, that's why it's so cheap. The property is beautiful. It's well kept, but no one wants to be here because of the history. The real estate agent says, here, why don't you and your wife just go talk about it? We can leave if you guys aren't comfortable with this. Ultimately, they decide to purchase the property. So a couple weeks later, Rob and Vicky and their 2 teenage sons move into Fox Hollow Farms, and they love it. And especially their 2 teenage sons love swimming in the pool. And they had gotten in the habit of basically running around outside and then tracking in dirt and gravel into the swimming pool. And so one day, Vicky is vacuuming up some of this dirt and gravel that had gotten inside of the area around the pool. And so she's vacuuming up the gravel, and all of a sudden her vacuum cuts out. And in fact, the power cord where the vacuum was attached to had come undone. And so she thinks, oh, I must have, yanked on the cord and pulled it out of the outlet. And so she goes over and she plugs it back in, and she goes back to vacuuming up the gravel that was in the pool. And so as she's doing that, it goes out again, which surprised her because she remembered thinking to herself, like, don't yank on the cord because you just unplugged it. And she turns around, and now the cord from the vacuum and the outlet it was plugged into are separated by about a foot. That it was as if it had been like yanked out pretty hard. And she's thinking to herself, like, did I just yank on it again? Like, am I wrapped on a chair or something? Like, how did I yank it out, and how did it move a foot away from the outlet? And so after she plugs it in, she checks it and kind of yanks on it to make sure it's not falling out on its own. Like, it's not a, kind of weak connection to the port. And it's not. It's in there secure. And she goes back to vacuuming, and she's looking over her shoulder and checking the outlet as she's vacuuming, like wondering, like, what was causing it to to pop out of the socket like that. And as she's looking at it, she watches it pop out of the socket again. Except it didn't just fall to the ground. It like jumped out, as if there was a surge of electricity that, popped it out of the socket or something. And she drops the vacuum because it startled her and she didn't know what to make of it. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees, Joe, was chronically late. And it got to the point where Rob's like, Joe, what's going on? Like, why are you always late? And Joe said, I live over an hour away and I can't get here on time. I got to find somewhere, to live that's closer to the dealership. And Rob is like, well, actually, we have an entire apartment attached to our residence at Fox Hollow Farms that no one's staying in. We'd be happy to let you rent that out. It's right down the road. And Joe's like, actually, that sounds pretty great. And so just a couple days later, Rob helps Joe move into the new apartment. And they spend the whole day moving all the boxes and furniture in there. And just in the span of just a few hours, they move everything into Joe's apartment. Rob leaves. Joe is exhausted. It's just he and his dog, Fred. And Joe just decides to crash for the night, and he lays down in the bed and falls asleep. And so that night, he has this dream where he's being chased by someone. He doesn't know what it is, but it causes him to actually act out his dream, like sleepwalk. He jumps up out of his bed and starts running as if he needs to escape the apartment, but he's like kind of half dreaming, and he runs into the door frame, falls to the ground, knocks a glass over, and actually cuts his hands up pretty bad. And so he like comes to and he's like looking around and he's like, what was that? So a couple days later, Vicky comes home and she finds Rob painting the side of the house. And she and Rob stop and are talking about how beautiful it's going to look when the painting's done. And out of the corner of her eye, Vicky sees something in the forest that was on the edge of their property. And it was actually a man standing with a red t-shirt on, just standing like looking at their property. And as she's looking at him, he turns around and he starts walking away farther into the forest. And so she kind of looks, and before she says anything to Rob, the guy has just vanished into the woods. And so she just goes, Rob, I just saw someone standing on our property. He had a red shirt on and he was right over there. And Rob immediately is like, well, honestly, we moved into a serial killer's house. We should accept that there's going to be people that are just going to want to sneak onto our property to get a look at this building. And so they walk over to where Vicky has seen this guy in red, and they look, and there's no one there. They yell out like, hey, is anybody here? And no one's there. And so even though it was pretty unsettling, Vicky and Rob just decide that I guess this is the reality of living here, is that you're going to have people spying on you a little bit because of the notoriety of the home. So later that night, Joe is in his apartment and he's doing some dishes, and it's late at night, probably like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and he hears a knock on the door. And he's literally mid dishes, his hands are wet, and so he turns off the water and he yells out, hey, just a second, and he starts toweling off his hands. And as he's doing that, the knocking gets louder and more aggressive, and he's like, hey, hold on, I'm just drying my hands off, hold on. And he assumes it's Vicky or Rob. And so he starts walking over, and the knocking is just incessant. And he finally opens the door, and no one's there. It wasn't like the knocking was going on and stopped, and then he went over there and opened it. It was literally like the knocking was happening as he's opening the door, and no one is standing there. He's like immediately on guard. Like, okay, is someone like on the roof, like bending down? Is someone hiding? Like, what's going on? And he kind of pokes his head out and he's looking around, and he actually steps out onto the front steps there, and he's looking around, and he figured like if someone had knocked, they'd be running away if they're gone already, and he can't hear anything. It's just silent. There's no one there. And then he goes back into his apartment, shuts it, bolts the door shut, and out of the corner of his eye, he spots what looks like a man in his bedroom, basically just walking past the door frame into his bedroom. And it totally startles him. His dog starts growling and looking in the direction of the bedroom. And so he walks over there and looks in his bedroom, and there's nothing there. He flips on all the lights, he looks around, and he's like, what's going on here? Like, it totally scared him. So Joe had only been in this apartment for about 3 weeks. And one of the things he had kind of developed a habit doing was in the evenings, he would take his dog Fred for a walk along the driveway that was, well lit, and the driveway was pretty long. It's a big piece of property, and he would take his dog up to the end of the driveway and then walk back. And because of what he's just witnessed with the knocking on the door and what looked like someone in his apartment, he decides he just wants to clear his head and go on a walk with his dog. And he figured he could maybe swing by the main house and see if the lights were on in Rob and Vicky's house, because in some way, maybe if their lights were on, it would indicate that maybe they had been over and had been knocking on his door, and tomorrow he'll find out what it was about. Like, he's searching for a way to rationalize this. And he notices right away that Vicky and Rob's house is totally dark. They're asleep. He doesn't make it very far when his dog stops. The dog starts taking off into the tree line. And before Joe actually takes off after his dog, he looks up and he breaks out through some of the lighting over the driveway that there is a man in red with a red t-shirt that's at the edge of the forest. And his back is turned and he's walking into the forest, and as Joe's looking, it looks like the man in red actually disappears. And so the dog is heading straight for this man in red. And so Joe, because it's his dog, he loves his dog, he starts running after the dog. Even though he's absolutely terrified of what's going to happen here, he couldn't let his dog get harmed. So he chases into the woods, makes it like a few feet into the woods where he finds his dog that's now not barking and is actually facing back out at Joe. And it's kind of cowering, looking at where Joe is now standing. And Joe kind of begins to turn, and the man in red is standing right next to him, looking directly at Joe. And Joe just panics and starts running out, doesn't stop to do anything. The dog follows Joe, and they run back to Joe's apartment, run upstairs, shut the doors, shut the blinds, lock everything, and they just sit there. For the rest of the night, Joe is literally checking his window and looking outside because he doesn't know if he just saw that or not, because that person in red had vanished a minute ago. He thought that perhaps he was convincing himself that he saw someone in red because he had just seen like a ghost in his apartment like a few minutes earlier. And he's starting to think that maybe he's just kind of hallucinating all this stuff, or that he's imagining all this stuff. So he wasn't quite prepared to go tell Rob and Vicky or do anything about it. So he just spent the night basically looking out his window and making sure no one was coming into his residence again. And so the next morning goes and tells Rob and Vicky what happened the night before. Everything from the knocking on the door to the person that he thought he saw inside of his apartment to then ultimately the man in red that his dog chased after. As he's telling them about this exchange with the man in red, Vicky is getting pretty emotional. And Vicky is like, I saw a man in red. And she points to the area of their property, and it's the same area that Joe had just been describing where this had all happened. She was like, I saw a man in red right over there. Like, what's going on? So that night, Joe is in his apartment, and Joe is definitely on edge about what had happened the night before. He's increasingly almost listening for noises outside because of how scary the night before was. And he forgoes his walk on the driveway with his dog. I think he's pretty much done doing that after that encounter. And as he's in his apartment, he hears knocking on the door again. And he yells, "Who is it? Who's at the door?" And no answer. But the knocking continues. And it's one of those knockers. It's the actual knocker on the outside of the door that's being hit over and over again. He can see the door actually shaking from how hard this is being banged against the door. And finally, after like poking his head out and seeing no one, he rips the door open and no one's there. And he looks at the door itself, and the knocker is perpendicular to the ground, like someone's holding it up, but no one's there. And as he's looking at it, it swings down and knocks the door one last time. He slams the door shut, locks it, and he's absolutely petrified. He sees the doorknob on the door start to turn, and he can hear the sound of the spring tightening as the doorknob slowly turns all the way over into the open position. The door's locked, but the doorknob's been twisted. And he's looking at the door, and then there's silence after the doorknob's being held in the, call it, open position. And then all of a sudden it bursts open, breaking the lock. No one's outside. And he looks at it and he's absolutely frozen for a second. And then he just runs out of his apartment to see who is doing this. No one's there. When he turns around and looks into his apartment, he sees a man in white, not in red, who is soaked head to toe, screaming and running towards him, who runs out of the apartment past him and vanishes into the air. And so he takes off. Joe, he's not sticking around, grabs his dog, runs to Rob and Vicky's, and he goes in and tells them what happened. Joe, Rob, and Vicky are so scared that now they're not trying to rationalize that this wasn't a ghost, let's say. They're trying to convince themselves that this is a friendly ghost, that these are the victims of Herbert Baumeister that have been tormented by Baumeister, but they're here because they're trapped here. That man you saw in your apartment, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister, escaping from Herbert Baumeister. The man in red, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister. We're dealing with the victims here because so many people had their lives snuffed out here. And so it isn't really calming them, but it's like they're creating a narrative that fits what's happening. Because without a story, this is impossible to understand. And so they really start to believe that what they're experiencing is a haunting, but it is of Herb Baumeister's victims basically acting out their final moments or kind of leading them to, what happened to these victims. And so that night, Joe, Rob, and Vicky start going online and researching who the victims were. The known victims of Herb Baumeister. And there's images of all of these different victims. And as they're scrolling through all the pictures, Joe stops them on one and he goes, "That's the guy that was in my apartment. It looks exactly like the guy that was soaking wet, screaming, that ran out of my apartment." Like, that confirms, this is a confirmation to the three of them, that the entity they're experiencing in this property is definitely the victim. So they do feel reassured at this point. Scared, but reassured that these are the victims. And so they start really aggressively researching the Baumeister case, and they come to realize that there's actually a number of victims, more than likely, that have not been uncovered, that have been buried on this property, only lending in their mind more credibility to the idea that this is a property that is haunted by the victims of Herb Baumeister. And so after a couple of days where there isn't much activity, Joe decides to go for a walk in the woods in the same area where the man in red had been seen by Vicky and by himself a couple days earlier. And he just decides, in broad daylight, I'm going to go for a walk with my dog out in the woods. And so he starts walking in that direction, and literally sitting on the leaves, like practically on the trail in plain sight, is a human bone. It's a femur bone just sitting on the trail. Like, the idea that bone wouldn't have been located during the extensive search for bones on this property is nearly impossible. To Joe, the way he described it is, I feel like that bone was left there for me to discover it. That the man in red, who was more than likely a victim of Herb Baumeister, had led me to finding that bone. And so they believe, Joe, Rob, and Vicky, that when they send this bone in for forensic analysis, that they'll determine that this was another victim that perhaps hasn't been identified yet. And they're kind of expecting it to be the man in red, whoever that was. And so they end up calling, Rob ends up calling the lead detective from the Baumeister case and says, "Hey, we found a bone." And so they submit that and they take it in as evidence. And Rob asks the lead investigator if he would mind coming to the property and just kind of explaining to them, where things occurred on the property relative to the Baumeister case. Where did all the tragedy unfold? Like, where were people buried? Just to give us a sense of what we're dealing with here. And so the investigator agrees, and the investigator comes out, and the vast majority of the killings happened in the swimming pool, where Baumeister would basically lure young men to come to his property to go swimming. And as soon as they got in the pool, he would strangle them to death. And the weird thing about the pool area is that Baumeister was, a psychopath, and he had put mannequins all over the inside of this swimming pool that had like party outfits on. And so there are these very eerie pictures of the swimming pool with like mannequins all around the outside. And it was basically a place where he lured his victims and ended their lives. A couple days later, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some work at his computer, and he hears a metallic scraping sound coming from his kitchen. And so he goes over to his kitchen and he finds that all of the knives that were in his butcher's block have been pulled out and lined up neatly in the bottom of his sink, like very neatly arranged. And he's looking at it like, I didn't do that. And he turns towards his workstation, like as if to look around the room. And he notices on the island that sits where he was standing right in front of him, a little bit low down, like halfway up the island, there was all these fresh cut marks in the wood, like a number of cut marks across the wood. And he's looking at that and he's thinking to himself, is this one of the victims telling me that, perhaps they had been attacked with a knife right here in the kitchen? He's thinking like it's his duty to try to figure out which victim this was and what happened to them. And so he gets his iPhone out and he turns on the voice recorder and he starts recording and asking some questions of the room. And he first make sure to turn off the TV, turn off the AC so it's quiet. And so with his recorder, he starts asking, like, who's anybody here? And there's silence. And he's like, who was the person in the kitchen, who was walking through the kitchen. And there's silence. And then when he asks again about was there anybody in the kitchen, his dog starts growling and reacting to something in the room. And now Joe hasn't heard anything. He's not heard any confirmation that, there's someone in the room. He actually felt quite silly doing it. He takes his phone back to his computer because he takes his dog growling as maybe somehow confirmation that there was something there. And he downloads the audio file and he listens to it. And as he's listening to the file, right after he asks about is there anybody in the kitchen, he gets a response.
Who keeps walking in the kitchen?
Who's in the kitchen? The married one. And so as Joe is looking through all their files, he's seeing that every single victim was single. No one's married. They're all young men who are single. The only one who was married, involved in this case, was none other than the serial killer himself, Herb Baumeister. And so Joe has had this revelation, and it's when he realizes that it's not just the victims here. Herb Baumeister, the serial killer himself, is haunting this property. A 1979 New York Times article described her story as being, quote, one of the Western world's most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation. I myself am not a huge believer in reincarnation, mostly because any of the stories I've heard, there's no modern day corroboration of fact. But in Dorothy Eady's case, or as she became known, Setti's case, she has a number of things that line up with her story, with her lifelong story, that she in fact was from ancient Egypt and was actually a priestess in ancient Egypt times. And some of her discoveries are pretty incredible. And frankly, Egyptologists and historians that have looked at this case have spent decades trying to prove that she was lying, but can't. She had information that she shouldn't have had that begins to make you wonder, maybe she really was reincarnated. Before we get started, if you could please gently destroy the like button and then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. I'm going to be posting a ton of content just like this as many times a week as I can. I'm aiming for 3, if not 4, every week going forward, so please come along. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have Dorothy Eady, who as a child has a near-death experience. When she kind of comes back, she believes that she is no longer home, that her home is somewhere else. She starts having dreams about this place. She describes this garden and this big building, and then eventually she discovers that what she's describing is a place in ancient Egypt. And she ends up becoming obsessed with ancient Egypt and then begins providing information and helping with archaeological digs that leads to numerous incredible discoveries, all from memories that she claims to have had from her previous life. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation and this whole story seems like totally made up, just listen to how the story flows and then try to make sense of how in the world she had the information she had that led to distinct discoveries that nobody else had made. That they found this stuff as a result of Dorothy Eady's information. How do we reconcile that? It's not impossible, but no one's been able to do it yet. So let's see what you think. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family in London in 1904. She was an only child and she was absolutely adored by her parents. Now, unfortunately, when she was 3 years old, she fell down a flight of stairs in her home and was unconscious. They called the doctor and the doctor shows up and says she's actually dead. As the parents are talking to the doctor, after about an hour, Dorothy gets up and goes into her bedroom and is like playing on her bed. And the parents come in with the doctor and they can't make any sense of it. And in fact, the parents were furious at the doctor for pronouncing her dead because they're like, obviously she wasn't. If she's just fine now, like, who are you? What kind of doctor are you? The doctor swears she was dead. Shortly after the accident, Dorothy develops a strange accent that they can't quite place. And doctors and specialists believe that she's suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome, which is fairly common amongst people with significant head injuries. Basically, it alters your speech, and to people that don't know any better, they might think that you just have a strange foreign accent. Dorothy also started telling her parents about this recurring dream she had, where she'd be near this huge building with these big pillars, and she'd be in this beautiful garden. She loved this garden. She talked about the beautiful flowers and her friends that were there, and it was just this unbelievable place. It was like this oasis next to this building, but she didn't know where it was, and she's 3-4 years old, so she's not able to articulate much what this is, but she was just in love with this garden and this location in her dreams, and she talked about it endlessly. Dorothy's mother would find her daughter on her bed either before she went to sleep or when she woke up crying, because Dorothy longed to actually be in this place in her dreams, which she started calling home. Now, Dorothy's mother would say, but Dorothy, you're home now. And she would say, no, I'm not home. My home is in that garden. It's near that building. And no matter how Dorothy's mother tried to kind of convince her that, no, honey, you live here now. You live here. You've never lived anywhere else. Dorothy was unbelievably convinced that what she was seeing in her dreams was her actual home. It was around this time that Dorothy's parents brought Dorothy to a British museum where they had a big ancient Egyptian exhibit set up. And when they went into the museum, Dorothy sees this exhibit and she's immediately attracted to it. And as she gets closer, she starts seeing the statues of the pharaohs and pictures of the pyramids, and she sprints into the exhibit, runs away from her parents, and she's running to the different statues of the pharaohs and of the Sphinx and all of these different icons from ancient Egypt, and she's kissing their feet and she's sobbing hysterically, and she's yelling, I'm home, I'm with my people. This little tiny kid is having this revelation that she's found home, and she refused to leave the museum. Finally, her parents, get her to calm down. They're pretty embarrassed as people are looking at them like, what's going on with your child? She finally leaves with her parents, but at this point, now Dorothy has attached that place in her dreams that she longs to go with the beautiful garden. She's attached it to Egypt, to ancient Egypt. And so she becomes completely obsessed with ancient Egypt. Her obsession with ancient Egypt started to get her in trouble. When she'd go to Sunday school, her family is a very, very devout Catholic family. She would compare Catholicism to other ancient Egyptian religions. That got her in a lot of trouble, and in fact, they said, you can't come to Sunday school anymore. Then she got expelled from her Catholic school because she refused to sing a number of the hymns that in some way disparaged ancient Egyptians. She was also told that she could no longer attend Sunday Mass for the same reasons. She was basically not welcome anymore. At 6 years old, Dorothy, who knew how to write and read in English, started to take a keen interest in hieroglyphics, the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she said that they were definitely familiar to her, but she had forgotten how to read it. When she was 7, she was looking through a textbook and she saw a picture of the Temple of Seti I, which is in Abydos, Egypt. And as soon as she saw the picture, it was a big picture of the temple, and then next to it kind of like the broken remains of what looks like maybe a garden of some kind. And she immediately said, that is my home. That's where I'm from, right there. Temple of Seti I in Abydos, Egypt. That's my home. And as she's looking at the picture and she's looking at those kind of tattered, broken remains, this is thousands of years old, she's looking at the area next to this big temple in the picture. And she's like, that's the garden, but where are the trees? Where is everything? Why does it look like this? She didn't understand that was thousands of years ago that it was a garden. But she saw the picture and immediately knew it as her home. Also in the textbook was the picture of the pharaoh, Seti I, who the temple was named after. And when she saw the picture of the very well-preserved mummy, she was overcome because she claimed to have known him personally. At age 10, Edie was kind of discovered by world-renowned Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, who offered to teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics, which she picked up almost instantly. Starting at 14, in addition to that recurring dream of the Temple of Seti and the garden right next to the Temple of Seti that she claimed was her home, she started having a recurring nightmare where she, in her former life, was in this subterranean enclosure, and she was being questioned by a high priestess who was demanding that she answered her questions, and when she refused, she was beaten. At 27 years old, Edie meets an Egyptian man and falls in love with him, but also, I'm sure on some level, she was marrying him to secure Egyptian residency, because as soon as they got married, they moved right back to Egypt, where she could be a resident. And actually, when they landed in Egypt, the first thing she did, she's overcome with emotion when she lands, and she starts kissing the ground and crying and saying, "I'm home, I'm home." Dorothy and her Egyptian husband have a son, and they name him Seti, just like the pharaoh Seti. Once Edie moved to Egypt, she started, by her account, getting visits from an entity known as Hor-Ra. Now, Hor-Ra, she claimed, was the spirit of the pharaoh Seti I. She would get into these almost trance-like states at night over that first year she was in Egypt. It was like she'd be sleeping, but then she would get up and be in this trance, and she would start frantically writing in hieroglyphics in the middle of the night. And her husband would wake up and he would see her doing this, and she was like, he couldn't stop her. He couldn't communicate with her. She was just in a trance, recording what she was claiming Hor-Ra was telling her, was dictating to her that she needed to write down. And it was in fact about who she used to be. She used to be, according to Hor-Ra, a woman by the name of Ben Trishit, who lived 3,000 years earlier in the time of Pharaoh Seti I, and who lived in the temple of Seti in and around that garden. So after a year of her going into these trances and writing in hieroglyphics, she had over 70 pages of transcript of what she claims was her story. And it goes like this. Before being born as Dorothy Edie, she was an Egyptian woman named Ben Trishit. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a vegetable seller who actually died when she was just 3 years old. Unable to care for her, Ben Trishit's father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan. She was then raised at the temple, where she later became a priestess. When she was 12 years old, Ben Trishit was given two choices: either venture out into the world on her own, or become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Ben Trishit decided to take the vows. But a few years later, she meets Pharaoh Seti I, and they end up falling in love, and soon she becomes pregnant. When she is discovered to be pregnant, she was interrogated by the high priest and beaten when she refused to answer, a scene that corresponded to her childhood nightmare. Unwilling to put her beloved Seti through a public scandal, Ben Trishit took her own life. Edie's husband grew increasingly disturbed watching his wife go into these trances and write out the hieroglyphics. I mean, she's amassing all these pages of hieroglyphics. Her whole thing was just too much for him, and so he ultimately filed for divorce in 1936. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her young son leave and go live in another town near the Giza pyramids, and she starts going by the name Seti, which means mother of Seti. So she doesn't go by Dorothy Edie anymore. And at this point, she also takes a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, and she begins a very lengthy and highly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti would research almost exclusively the temple of Seti I and learn everything about not only the temple, but the people who lived there, because it was where she believed she used to live. But it wouldn't be until 1952, when she's almost in her 50s, that she finally actually steps foot in Abydos. And it was because of a job transfer that put her there. And in fact, she took a pay cut to get this job. She was so desperate to just finally step foot in the place that she believed was her old home. As soon as she walked into the temple, the first thing she says is, "It's as if I've lived here before." And she quickly sets up an office in one of the temple rooms and spends almost all of her time there. And she even befriends a cobra and feeds the cobra daily, and just has this cobra friend that just hangs out with her, which no one could make any sense of. Lots of rumors swirled around whether this woman was sane, but because her contributions to Egyptology were so pronounced and so useful, that she was very highly regarded. But of all of her accomplishments, of all of the things that she did, the thing that she is most known for is when she was able, as soon as she got to the temple of Seti I, identify exactly where the garden was. For Seti, she'd been having dreams of this garden her whole life. And so she very quickly said, "If you dig here, you're going to find this garden." And Sure enough, they dug down and there was the garden. And in fact, she had described the layout of the garden, what trees were where, what types of trees were there, and it was all confirmed once they dug it up. She was also instrumental in identifying where to dig on the north side of the temple, where she said there was a tunnel that ran underneath. It was a secret tunnel. And sure enough, they dug down, there was the tunnel. That was something that they had never seen before. Only she knew about it, and there was no way she would have known about it without prior knowledge. In addition, she also pointed researchers to search in a specific area, in an area known as the Valley of the Kings, for a tomb, a long forgotten tomb. And sure enough, almost exactly where she described, there was in fact a tomb that had never been discovered before. As much as other Egyptologists did not want to accept Seti's claims that she had been reincarnated, and that's why she has all this knowledge, they wanted, frankly, it to be just the ramblings of a crazy person and it to just be some elaborate hoax, but they couldn't deny the fact that she had intimate knowledge of certainly everything that ever happened at the temple of Seti I in the time frame that she claimed to have been living there, 3,000 years prior. Fascinatingly, right before she died, when she was 81, she said that there was a secret underneath the temple of Seti I. There was a secret chamber, and there was a secret within that secret chamber. But no one's ever gone down there. No one knows where to begin to look. And so without Seti guiding them, it may be one of those things that we'll just never know. So without any sort of rational explanation for how she would have had all this knowledge or understanding of an ancient culture, it leaves skeptics wondering, is this potentially a real case of reincarnation, or is there a better explanation? And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Some call this location the most paranormal location on the planet. Others call this whole thing just a big hoax. But what is undeniably true, and frankly what makes this case so much more interesting, is that unlike the vast majority of paranormal stories and claims, this case was put to an enormous amount of scientific scrutiny. In fact, there was a decade-long study done on this case where PhDs and scientists converged on this one location and basically around the clock studied, all these claims of the paranormal that was happening in the area. And after a decade of research, the findings are pretty mind-blowing. And the case that I'm referring to is none other than the very famous Skinwalker Ranch. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have a family that purchases a ranch out in Utah, and as soon as they move in, they start noticing some pretty bizarre things around their property. Everything from, some of their livestock going missing or being harmed. They have strange sightings in the woods of creatures and lights in the sky. They eventually report it to the news, and that news story gets picked up by a couple of other outlets. And a billionaire who is obsessed with researching the paranormal sees this story. He buys the property and installs an entire team of scientists and researchers to basically try to figure out what was happening at this ranch. And they spend 10 years studying this ranch. The outcome is, turns out some strange things really were happening there. Before we get started, if this type of content appeals to you, the kind of strange, dark, mysterious content delivered in a story format, if that appeals to you, that's what my channel's all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, please gently ransack the like button and then turn on all notifications so you can get all of my content every time I upload every week. All right, on with the story. In the northeastern corner of Utah lies a 500-acre plot of land, it's all desert, where a ranch sits, and that is Skinwalker Ranch. It was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was actually built on a piece of land that had apparently been cursed. Prior to its construction, the Navajo tribe had a feud with the Utes Native American tribe. The Utes were selling off other Native Americans that they would capture. They would sell them into slavery to the United States. And so the Navajo, who had previously lived in the area where this ranch actually was built, they were forced off their land as the Utes came in and were rounding them up and selling them into slavery. Then before the Navajo left that area, they cursed the land with what's called the Skinwalker curse. The idea was they were going to torment the Utes tribe for the hardships they had inflicted on the Navajo. The Skinwalker curse, legend has it, is this curse where these witches descend on the area and take the form or wear the skin of various predatory animals in the area, namely large wolves and foxes. They inhabit those bodies and terrorize anybody in the cursed land. At some point, this ranch is actually built on the land that had apparently been cursed. It wasn't until many years later when owners of that ranch started seeing predatory animals doing some very strange things in and around their property that they did some research on the area, learned about this curse, and then before long, the nickname had stuck. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased Skinwalker Ranch. It had actually been abandoned by the previous owners for the last few years, so when they purchased it, they got it for way below market price. So they are just so excited to be moving in. They breed cattle, and so they had 500 acres to let their cattle free roam. It was like the dream purchase for this family. And so when they finally do move in, like the day they move in, they don't really care that the grass is overgrown. It looks like things are kind of in disrepair. And in fact, when they go into the homestead, like the actual house on the property, they were so excited about everything that they kind of overlooked some of the strange things that they immediately noticed about the property. They go inside and every window has a deadbolt on it. The inside and outside of every door in the house, not just the doors leading outside, doors leading between rooms had locks, the front and back side. They noticed these big pikes that were driven into the ground at the front door and back door of the property with massive chains stringing off of them, which looked like pretty powerful guard dogs had been there. They're thinking to themselves, well, this is a huge piece of property. Perhaps the previous owners are a little bit paranoid because they're kind of isolated. And so they didn't really raise a red flag when, to be honest, had I moved into a property where every single door and window had multiple locks on it, they had these big guard dogs, I'd probably ask a couple questions. But you know what? Terry and Gwen, they're just so excited about this purchase that, again, they kind of just overlook it. So on the day that they are moving in, Terry and Gwen have some family members over to help them offload trucks and move stuff into the homestead. And it's during this process as they're moving things out of the truck into the house. And again, you got to remember that the house is situated like right in the middle of the property. And you can see in every direction, basically unobstructed, because it's basically open desert, with the exception of a couple areas that are, basically forests. And as they're offloading some of the stuff into the house, Terry looks out at one of these tree lines and he notices this huge wolf, or what looks like a wolf, pretty well off in the distance, kind of meandering its way over towards them. But it's far enough off that this is not enough to be totally worried about it. After all, Terry was a rancher and his family were fairly rugged. They carried weapons and they were used to, protecting their livestock from predators. So this was not a, oh my goodness, I can't believe a wolf is near us. It was more like, okay, let's make a note that there's a wolf walking towards us. And so Terry he tells his family, hey guys, just so you know, there's a wolf coming towards us right now. And the whole family is now standing near the truck and they're watching this wolf. And Terry recalled as he's staring out watching this wolf, it's kind of almost walking in like a snake, like a serpentine path towards them from hundreds of yards out. It's still quite a ways out. Terry notices that there was a fence that was out where this wolf is. And the fence was pretty big, and the spaces between posts were about 6 feet. When he had a good look at the wolf next to the fence, he could tell that the wolf was at least 6 feet long. And he was thinking, are my eyes playing a trick on me? Like, that's an enormous wolf. That's the biggest wolf I've ever seen. But the wolf wasn't acting angry or aggressive. It was just kind of skulking its way towards him, very nonchalant, broad daylight. And at some point, Terry and the family, they're standing behind the truck, and Terry said that they all had this feeling that the wolf was not going to harm them. And the wolf got about 100 yards away, and Terry and his family are transfixed. And he even said he didn't understand why they weren't scared or why they weren't, running away or shooting at it or something, but they didn't. All of them are just standing there watching this wolf that's massive. And the wolf is wagging its tail and acting like a domesticated dog. The wolf comes over and goes up near Terry's father, who was there helping unload some of the gear they had. And Terry's father just kind of reflexively reaches out to start petting this. He's petting like up at his head level, this massive wolf. And the wolf just acts like a domesticated dog and kind of rubs against his hand and then starts walking away from them, just wagging its tail and not doing anything, not causing them any harm, not snarling, not growling, nothing. But just as nonchalantly as it walked over to them, it walks over to where they had a pen with a couple of cows and calves inside of this pen. And one of the calves had its head through the post that was keeping them in this cage, just kind of watching this wolf. And the wolf notices it and in an instant jumps over to this calf and immediately has the whole head of the calf in its jaws, just trying to rip it out of the cage. But it can't get it to squeeze through the cage. And so all of a sudden, like Terry and his family are broken out of this weird trance. And Terry starts firing shots at the wolf. It strikes the wolf and has no impact. They run over, they start hitting it with the back end of an axe. They're trying to get this thing off of the calf because their livestock, that was their livelihood. And these are rugged people, and so they're trying to fight to save their property, to save their cows. And the wolf is just totally unaffected. It's not trying to attack Terry or his son that are trying to get rid of it. The wolf is just trying to attack the cow, but it won't let go. And finally, it just kind of gives up on the calf, starts kind of retreating. Terry ends up getting his rifle, a high-powered rifle, and takes a shot at the wolf one more time. But again, it just has no impact on the wolf. And the wolf just, at some point, just as, I guess, bored, turns around and kind of trots off into the woods. After they kind of were brought out of that initial trance, that they remembered this horrible smell, this like foul, almost chemical smell that just permeated the whole area after the wolf was there. Terry and his son, they decided to go track this wolf because now there's this massive predator that's going to make owning cattle extremely difficult. And so they would have to go deal with this predator. And so instead of retreating into the house, they grab their weapons and they track the wolf that's now jogged off into the forest. And they make it to an area in the forest where the ground is very muddy and sodden. And Terry could easily make out these footprints that just suddenly stop. And they just couldn't make sense of it. And so they went back to the house and they told their family, like, we tracked it into the woods. There's no blood trail. There's nothing. It just walked in and vanished. So this is day one of being at this ranch, and they're all on edge now. The whole family is on edge. They really don't know what to make of that wolf. The sheer size of it, the fact that it was totally unaffected by being shot multiple times. There's real concern over their own livelihood because they keep cattle and they're only going to have more that are going to be out in these pens. And if there are wolves that are 3 times the size of a normal wolf that are walking around killing cattle, that's a big problem if you own cattle. And so they're on edge and they're all in a way trying almost not to talk about how crazy and how bizarre that encounter with the wolf was. They're just like, they're treating it like it's just a normal predator problem. Like, man, we gotta get those wolves, we gotta protect our cattle. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're like, something very strange is happening here. Gwen, she was having some other very strange things that were happening to her that she was not tying to the wolf thing. She was just noticing a couple of distinct things that were happening to her that made her think that she actually had a very real, medical problem, that she had true memory issues. Because 2 things happened. One, in that first week, she had gone to the grocery store, and when she came back, she put the groceries away, and then she left to go to the other room. And when she came back, all the groceries were now back in the bags. And so for 20 minutes, she's just sitting there dumbfounded with, did I put the groceries away? Same day, she goes to take a shower and she hangs her towel in the bathroom like anyone would, and she takes a shower. And then when she gets out, the towel's missing. And she's like, she gets another towel and she towels off. And then she finds the towel hanging up in a closet on the other side of the house. And so between the groceries and the towel, she's like, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Am I having a medical issue here that I'm literally losing my mind? And it wasn't until Terry actually had a similar experience that she started to wonder if this had to do with maybe that strangeness with the wolf, that maybe there's just something odd happening about this property. And it was Terry, in that first week, he had been digging holes for a new fence. And he had this big fence digging tool. It was about 70 pounds that he was using to dig the holes for the fence. And so he had taken a break after making a bunch of posts for this fence. He took a break, left his fence digging tool, at the last place he had dug a post, and he went in to grab a bite to eat, came back out, and his fence digger is missing. And initially he just goes into the house and he's like, hey, to his wife, to his kids, like, did you guys move my fence digger? Like, do you know what happened to it? Like, where is it? It's not out there. And they're like, no, we've been in the house the whole time. I have no idea. And so they couldn't find it. And a week goes by and he's out patrolling his property looking for wolves. And in the tree, like well away from where he had been digging the post before, in the tree, his fence digging tool that's 70 pounds is like 70 feet in the air, strung up in this tree. So Terry comes back to the house and he tells his family about the fence digging tool being in the tree. And that's when Gwen tells Terry about her experiences with the groceries going back in the bag and a towel being moved around the house. And everybody in the family starts to really start being scared. We can't explain what's happening on this property, and we're very isolated. And what's the deal with all these locks on all the doors? I mean, they're starting to feel really concerned. Following the fence digging tool being found, Terry started to notice lights on his property. Initially, because this was the first couple of weeks they're there, he would see lights way at the far end of his property that looked like headlights, and he would think someone must have made a wrong turn that wound up on my property. I mean, we're kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and they'll just leave. And so when he first started seeing these lights, that's what he assumed it was, just people making a wrong turn. But he started to see it so often that he wondered if people were illegally hunting on his property. And so one night he sees these lights on his property and he goes out to investigate. In fact, he's angry. He's had all these strange things happen. His family's on edge, and now he's mad and he's going to take it out on this person who's illegally hunting on his property. And he starts charging out to these lights and he starts getting closer and closer, and he starts to realize it's not making any sound. If this was like a truck, it's not making any sound. And we're in an area where I could totally hear that if it was a vehicle, and he can't hear anything. And as he gets closer and closer, the lights start retreating from him without making a sound and then float up into the sky and disappear. And Terry's like, what is going on here? The winter rolls around and it's a particularly brutal winter. And one night he couldn't account for one of his cows. And so he's out looking for this one stray cow, and he searches his whole property, and there's only one area that he hasn't searched, and it's that forest where that giant wolf had disappeared after marching in there, and they tracked it in there. And so he goes in there, and as soon as he gets to the tree line, he notices there's a bunch of footprints from what looks like a cow. And he's relieved because it's probably his. And he follows it into the woods, and much like the wolf that had just disappeared in that muddy, sodden area in the forest, in the same spot, the footprints that appeared to be this cow had also just disappeared. And then over the course of the remainder of the winter, that would happen 4 more times. The animals would run away and just disappear without a trace. By the end of the winter, after all these animals have just mysteriously disappeared, Terry and his family, but Terry in particular, has really gone into full paranoia mode. He, at night, would just stalk his own property, hiding behind bushes with his weapon, and hope to see what was taking his cattle. And so one night, as he's doing another fruitless search around his property, he catches out of his periphery what looks like a kind of mass of something moving around in the trees near his property. And at this point, he was kind of obscured by some shrubs and some plants. And so he kind of crouched down and looked out at the tree line. And he sees in the tree line this strange shape kind of moving about inside of the trees. And he would describe the mass as looking almost like a stealth fighter jet, but really small. And it was making no sound, and it was hovering about 20 feet off the ground. And he's crouched down, not making a sound, watching it. And it's just kind of moving around the tree line. And it has these lights that looks to be kind of scanning the ground. And it's just kind of moving around. It's shining these lights, these multicolored lights in the ground. And Terry moves a tiny bit to get a better angle on this thing. And he makes the tiniest of noises against the brush, just like a tiny little, barely audible sound. And this mass that's pretty far away, the lights immediately turn off, and it angles itself so it's facing directly at Terry. And Terry can feel it right away that it's heard this tiny little sound he's made, and now it's staring directly at Terry. And Terry's like terrified, and he's looking at this thing wondering like, oh my God, like, is it gonna come take me? Like, what is this? Is this the thing that's been taking my livestock? And he's terrified, and he's staring at it, and it just flies away. By the spring of 1995, things have gotten really, really bad for Terry and his family. Now, not only are they losing livestock inexplicably, but they're showing up, the actual cows themselves are showing up back on their property, hours or days later, just kind of in random locations on the property, and they look like they've had surgery done, like precision cuts, and pieces of them are missing. And in addition, some very strange things are happening at the house. At night, they would see these entities walking around their property, these humanoid, they described them as having no expression, just walking around their property. And sometimes they would walk right up to the glass, put their hands on the glass and look in, but there was no face. And like Terry and his family, they had blinds down, and they would use the deadbolts on every single door and window, but they could hear them rapping at the glass, and they could hear them communicating in a language they didn't understand right outside of their house. And this became so regular that it was almost impossible to sleep. Terry's kids started performing very poorly in school because they weren't sleeping. Terry's wife, Gwen, she lost her job at the bank because she wasn't sleeping, and she was like delusional. They were all just at an absolute breaking point. Terry is now feeling totally disheartened. One night he's sitting on his porch with his rifle, and he notices out on the horizon a new phenomenon. He was used to seeing the lights on his property that would be off in the distance that would disappear, and he had previously seen that kind of like fighter jet thing that was scanning the area. Like, those were two types of lights he would see, but there was a new light he saw as he's sitting on his porch. It was almost like this orangey orb that appeared off in the distance. Since he had his rifle with a high-powered scope on it, he just lifts up his rifle and he looks through his high-powered scope, and he zooms in all the way, and he can see that this orb, he describes it as a portal. That as he's looking at it, it has almost like an oval shape to it. And even though it was nighttime, in the middle of the orange orb is this blue sky. It's as if he's looking through a portal into another world where it's broad daylight and there's a sky. And he doesn't know what to make of it, but he can see that a black figure is crawling out of this portal into his property. And it looks just like the black entities that were kind of basically walking around his property at night. In addition to these figures that are crawling, like imagine that scene from The Ring where the girl crawls out of the well. They're crawling out of this portal into his property and then scurrying away into the tree line. And he sees weird craft as well coming into his property through this portal, and then the portal shuts and disappears. Following this night with the orange portal, Terry started to notice blue orbs that he and his family would say were the worst and most terrifying thing of all of the things they experienced. And considering they had tall, featureless black humanoids peering in their windows and rapping on their windows, that's saying something, okay? So a blue orb started showing up on their property. And the way they described it, Terry and his family, was whenever the orb came near you, it gave you this extreme sense of anxiety. It was almost like it was emitting this feeling that you automatically got where suddenly you were unbelievably anxious and terrified of the blue orb. And then as soon as it left, you would, not be anxious anymore. And so one night he's sitting on his porch like he had begun doing, and he sees this orb show up on his property. And his 3 dogs are sitting with him that see the orb, and they start growling and barking. And so he lets his dogs go, thinking that maybe they can scare this thing off. And the dogs take off running towards this blue orb, and they chase it, and you can see the orb, Terry can see the orb that starts to kind of retreat. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, I finally won something. My attack dogs are gonna scare this orb away. And they chase off into the woods, and he sees this thing, the blue orb, retreat into the woods. And then when he's thinking again that finally a little victory for us, he hears his dogs yelping, and he's too terrified to go check it out. And so he ends up going inside and locking the doors, locking the windows like they had been, and just kind of retreating. So the next day, when the dogs haven't returned, Terry and his son, they go out looking for the dogs in the forest. And when they get out there, they get to a clearing and they find 3 stacks of ashes in like little burned out circles, as if there had been a fire previously in these 3 little spots. And it turned out it was the ashes of his 3 dogs that had gone into the woods. They had just been vaporized. Terry decides that it's time to leave, and he wants to sell the ranch. And so he puts the property up for sale and goes to a local news outlet, and he tells them about what's happening on his property. And as fate would have it, a billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in standing up this scientific research team, this all-star team of PhDs, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. Basically, he was obsessed with the paranormal and wanted to investigate the paranormal. And he had actually seen that fairly obscure story. When he saw that it was up for sale, Robert Bigelow, the billionaire, saw this great opportunity to buy the piece of property and actually make it the headquarters of his own scientific research team. Not only to investigate what was happening on Skinwalker Ranch, but use it as kind of a hub to do other scientific research. So he purchases the ranch, and Terry actually, even though he did not want to spend any time at the ranch, on some level wanted to know what the research was going to show, because he was very curious, like, what is going on at this ranch that's been plaguing my family. So he offers to stay on as kind of like the ranch manager, because, you know, Robert Bigelow and his team are a bunch of scientists and business people. They don't have any experience on the ranch, and so they're happy to keep him. So Terry is still connected to the ranch, but at this point he's sold it to Robert Bigelow. So Robert Bigelow's scientific team was called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, N-I-D-S, NIDS for short. And Bigelow had actually built the team before purchasing Skinwalker Ranch. And what he went out and did is he recruited some of the most incredible scientists and PhDs he could possibly recruit, but he didn't want people that were interested in the paranormal. He wanted people that were inherently skeptical, so that if he was ever able to kind of prove the existence of high strangeness, that he would have credibility in doing that. And so he went out and found these incredibly skeptical, incredibly smart scientists and PhDs. And so they move into Skinwalker Ranch, and the first thing they do is they need to start doing testing to make sure that this whole, all the stories about Skinwalker Ranch coming from Terry and his family were not just some grand illusion by the family, that, you know, they could have just made it up. And so they get in there and they start running these tests. So that first year, as they're running these tests, which are largely things like, okay, let's check the environment and see if there aren't any, you know, plants that are giving off spores that could be hallucinogenic that they're breathing in. Let's check their water supply and make sure there wasn't something happening in their water supply. Let's do psychological assessments of the family. Let's ask neighbors. Let's do all of our diligence to make sure it's not something environmental or psychological. And over that first year, while they're doing this research, there isn't much activity at the ranch, save a couple of instances where there were some strange lights. So that first year is fairly uneventful, but what's important is that the NIDS researchers come to a conclusion that this did not seem like a hallucination. This did not seem like a something coming from, you know, a plant or water supply. This seemed like the Terry and his family were really experiencing something odd. They just didn't know what it was. One day, Terry and actually Gwen, who was helping him, were tagging some of the new calves, the new cows that had been born, putting these little tags in their ears. And so Gwen was there helping. And so Terry and Gwen, they tagged this new calf, put a yellow tag in its ear, and they move on and they're tagging other animals. And so for about 40 minutes, their eyes and their attention are not focused on this one calf or that one area of the ranch. They're tagging other animals. And then their dog that was with them starts growling and reacting in the direction of where this calf had been. And so Terry and Gwen turn around and they look and they don't see anything. And they start walking over. They find the calf that they had tagged about 40 minutes ago has been basically surgically dissected. And all that's left are its legs and its head. And in addition, the ear where that tag was had been removed. And so they immediately call over the NIDS researchers. So the NIDS veterinarian comes over and looks at the scene and just can't make sense of it, because the incisions on the calf were so well done that it looked like someone with real surgical expertise had done this on an operating table. There was no sign that this was done by a predator, and there was no blood anywhere. So this prompts a massive search of the property, because in many ways, this is what the NIDS researchers are looking for, are real occurrences of something that is highly strange that they can go investigate. And so all of the researchers and everybody there begins searching the property for whoever was responsible for this dissection of the cow. And they start searching the property, and the dogs, they had all these guard dogs that were kept at each of these observation posts that they had set up around the ranch as soon as the NIDS team had moved in. They were all looking in the same direction, all four of these four observation posts, and they're all cowering in the back of their cages, all looking in the same direction. And so they start making their way towards the tree line where all these dogs are looking, and they stop short when Terry says, "I see something in the tree." So they stop their car and they're looking, and in the tree is this massive wolf, this like wolf-like humanoid that's basically perched on a tree limb. And Terry takes out his rifle and he aims at the creature up in the tree, this huge creature, and everybody sees it. All the NIDS researchers are looking at this creature and they're like, "Oh my God, what is that?" Terry starts firing at this thing, and it just disappears into the woods. And so the team charges into the woods, they fan out, and they pick up a couple of tracks of this huge thing that has like this massive footprint with these huge claws. But much like the wolf that had disappeared and the cattle that had suddenly disappeared when they went into the woods, they couldn't find any traces of this thing. But they did smell this horrible stench that Terry remembered smelling. It stuck with him that first day when that large wolf had come over on the very first day they were moving in. It was that same smell, but they couldn't find this huge animal. So dumbfounded, the NIDS researchers just go back to the property and no one can make sense of it. And they have the footprint and they have their own eyewitness testimony, but like they couldn't make sense of how something that big could just get away. And so over the following month, they're like searching the property and they're looking for any more signs of this huge creature or anything. The only thing they noticed is that the guard dogs consistently stayed in their kennels and did not want to come out. They were acting like they were kind of being hunted, and they were they were cowering quite a bit, and they were scared to go out in the open, but they couldn't find anything. So it was around this time that Terry and Gwen are kind of back to doing work around the ranch, and one day they're driving off to one section of the ranch and they pass by the corral where 4 of their prized bulls were. These are very expensive animals that are all in this enclosure. And so they drive past and they take a mental note that they're seeing these bulls in this enclosure, and they drive off to the other side of the ranch where they're doing some work, tagging animals and, building fences, whatever it is they were doing. But when they come back and they round a corner where they're first able to see that corral of bulls again, they are like, where are they? Because the bulls were not in their enclosure and they weren't anywhere. And so they're panicked because these are very expensive animals, and they run over, and Terry sees that the gates to the corral are still locked, but there's no bulls in there. There's no sign of a struggle or anything. And it just so happens that right next to the corral was this fairly small trailer that hadn't been used in years. In fact, it was literally wired shut. It was just sitting there. And Terry, just for whatever reason, runs over and looks in one of the windows. And inside of this tiny enclosure are these 4 bulls, completely calm, all crammed into this tiny trailer. They could barely fit. They're not fighting with each other or anything. They're just calmly sitting there as if they're in some kind of a trance. And Terry yells to Gwen, like, "Hey, they're over here. They're right here." And it like startles the bulls out of their trance. They start panicking and kicking, and they end up getting them out of this enclosure, and it takes them hours to finally round them up and get them back in the corral. But they're unharmed. But it is almost impossible to get even one bull into that small of an enclosure. It would take hours to maybe be successful at doing that. To get 4 bulls into that enclosure was pretty much impossible. And to do it when they basically were calm after they were in there is also somewhat impossible. And it was important to note that Terry saw when he looked in the window that the only entrance to that that trailer was wired shut still. It had not been undone. In fact, the cobwebs at the corner where the opening basically formed with the sides of the trailer, they were still intact, like it had not opened. And it made no sense how those bulls got in there. And so the NIDS researchers come over and they can't make sense of it either. Upon further investigation, the NIDS researchers found that the bars of the corral that held the bulls, a section of it had been highly magnetized. And so while they're doing this research, trying to figure out if magnetic fields has anything to do with the strange occurrences at the ranch, two of the NIDS researchers were on the outskirts of the property using their compass to look for magnetic fields. And they started smelling, they both reported smelling that horrible metallic, like rotting smell that other people had reported smelling anytime they saw that large wolf creature. And when they started smelling it, their compass started to flitter and then pointed away from north towards wherever the smell was. And they remember thinking that they felt like they were being watched. And it went on for a few moments and their compass didn't waver. It was aimed in the direction of the smell and they're both on opposite sides pointing in the same direction. And then at some point, the smell stops and they stop feeling anxious and the north arrows go back to the way they should have been. And then one of the most terrifying of all of the paranormal occurrences that happened at Skinwalker Ranch happened at the very end of 1997. Two NIDS researchers were up on a ridgeline overlooking the homestead. Every night it became commonplace to basically position NIDS researchers all over the property to basically be on the lookout for weird things that are happening. And these two researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape right near the homestead. And one of them had infrared goggles, and so he looks down at the orb and he can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening that sounded an awful lot like what Terry had seen on his porch when he saw that humanoid creature crawling out of the portal into his property. Well, these two researchers are looking at this portal and they see the same thing. They see this black human-like creature crawling out of this orange portal onto the ground, and then it starts running up the hill towards them. And they're like frozen with fear. They start smelling that horrible rotting metallic smell as this big human-like creature bounds up the mountain, and they can hear the shale under its feet as it runs up, and it goes right past them. About 30 feet away from them, they're looking at it, and it just barrels past them at a full sprint up into the mountainside. The following year, in 1998, the activity on the ranch declined significantly. All they had was the occasional strange lights here and there, but for the most part, it was done. And in fact, even though NIDS remained on the property, by 2004, the research just wasn't amounting to anything, so they pulled the plug on the operation. They did have footage of a number of the lights that were seen, but again, no one's going to take a picture of some random lights and say, oh, there you go, proof. You know, they demonstrated that there were, magnetic fields, and they have images of these calves that would reappear after looking like they'd had surgery done to them. They had hundreds of eyewitness reports. They have all this information, but none of it was really definitive proof, which was very frustrating to Robert Bigelow, to Terry and his family. And the way they described it is they felt like they were dealing with an entity or a group of entities that were just consistently one step ahead of them, that they could catch glimpses of what they were doing, but it was never enough to really understand what was happening. They never felt like they were in control. It was always clear that this entity or these entities were in control of the situation, and they never were in a good position to really record hard data or get good footage. Not to mention, this is 1998, this is the late 90s. No one just had an iPhone they can pull out and snap pictures. You had real cameras. And so the best they could do was some pictures of light and some of the animals that had been mutilated. There's been numerous books put together by some of the people that were a part of this NIDS research team, and to this day they believe that what they saw was a result of some paranormal activity. And to this day, many people believe that this is one of the most credible instances of paranormal activity occurring. Every year, dozens of people, hikers, hunters, backpackers, will go off into the wilds of North America and then come out again claiming to have seen Bigfoot, the 8 to 10 feet tall, intelligent, bipedal, hairy creature that kind of is a cross between man and beast. And there's literally been thousands of sightings of that particular creature all over North America. And despite the thousands of sightings, there's never been a substantiated claim, so Bigfoot has become an urban legend. But no matter how you feel about Bigfoot, whether it exists or it doesn't, if you read through some of the first-hand accounts of these people who claim to have seen Bigfoot in North America, some of them are horrifying. And one account that stands out to me as being the most terrifying comes out of Oregon. There's a couple hot spots all over North America where some of the most sightings of Bigfoot occur, and one of them is in Oregon. In particular, it's the northwestern section of Oregon. And that's where today's story is going to come out of, and it is Jeff Boiler's story. Jeff was a Marine. He was then a police officer. Then he became a deputy sheriff, and then he ultimately became a lawyer. What really stands out to me about Jeff's story is that he strikes me as a credible, skeptical guy who, when interviewed, because he's been on a TV show called Paranormal Witness on the Sci-Fi Channel, he did a follow-on interview. You can Google him, Jeff Boiler's Bigfoot sighting. The way he tells the story, it's like he's not trying to dress it up. He's not trying to make it more dramatic than it really was. It's like he's just telling you what happened to him. And he's not trying to create a theory as to what it was, but rather just, here it is. Here's what happened, as I remember it. And it allows you to listen to this story and really relate to it. And it makes it that much more eerie as you listen to what happened to him. And so today I'm going to be telling Jeff's story. But before I get into that, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format with lots of distracting hand gestures, then you have come to the right place, because that is all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that's something you'd be into, I would ask you to please gently disembowel the like button, and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. Back in 1997, Jeff Boiler was a fit, single guy that had been in the Marine Corps for a little while, and then he'd been a police officer, and now he was looking to do something new with his life, and he had always been a huge fan of nature. He loved hiking and hunting, and so he just kind of up and decided to move to Oregon to just be back in nature. And so he goes out to Oregon. He doesn't really know what he's going to do for a job. One of Jeff's friends, who is the elected sheriff of a very rural county in northwestern Oregon, reached out to Jeff and said, hey, with your background, you were in the Marine Corps, you were a police officer, would you want to be one of our deputy sheriffs out here in northwestern Oregon? And Jeff's like, wow, great, and took the job. So after being on the job for a couple of months, Jeff is really happy. He loves his job, and he gets off one day from work pretty early, and he steps outside, and he would recall that it was like one of the most beautiful days he had seen in recent memory. It was just this gorgeous day. And even though initially he was planning to just go home, he was like, you know what? I'm going to go on a hike. He wanted to go to this fairly hard to access section of the woods that was a little ways up the mountain where 20 years earlier, he had actually buried one of his very close friends. And so he thought, you know what? Today, I'm going to make that trip up to his grave. I'm going to pay my respects. That's a good way to spend such a beautiful day. So he hopped in his Jeep and he started driving over to the woods that would take him up to this gravesite. It was an unmarked trail, but he had a map. He knew where it was, so he headed over. Now, Jeff was highly competent in the wilderness, but it needs to be said that he was basically going to be hiking into a section of the Cascade Mountains that was unmarked. This is a very isolated, unmarked area. And in fact, Jeff would even say that sometimes when you would walk around this section of the Cascade Mountains, you would wonder to yourself, has anyone ever been here before? Like, this is such a wild and open expanse. Am I the first person to ever step foot here? It's a section of Oregon that is totally just wild. So Jeff arrives at the dirt lot that's right on the edge of this forest that goes up the side of this mountain. And before he steps in and starts making his way up, he gets his map out and he kind of roughly charts a course. Because again, there's no trail in here. He puts his map away and he begins walking up this mountain. He's been walking for about 2 hours and the terrain's really bad. And he decides, you know what, why don't I deviate from the course that I was on and try to get to a more open area that might be able to kind of bank around to get up to the gravesite. He looked on the map and he could see that parallel to where he was going up this mountain, there seemed to be a strip of clearing where it might be easier going. It would require a bit of work to get over to it, but once he was there, he believed he could get up to the gravesite. So before he makes that movement over to the clearing, there was a stream running right next to him, freshwater stream, and so he just bends down, he splashes some water on his face, he gets a drink, and before he actually starts moving towards this clearing, because now he's deviating from the path that he intended to take. And this is an unmarked trail. So he knew that he would need to be really certain where he was going. He didn't have a GPS, this is 1997. He just had his map and compass. So he pulls out his map one more time, he looks at where he needs to go, he closes it up. And so he pulls out his compass and he takes what's called an azimuth, which basically is a way to make sure you're going in the right direction. And so he pulls the compass up to his eye, and as he's looking, he sees just to the right of his viewpoint, about 20 feet above him, there is a tree and a boulder, and behind that tree, someone is watching him. And so he lowers his compass and he just kind of glances over, and he can tell that it's clearly a figure. It's got 2 eyes in its head and it's looking at him. And he's not immediately scared. He thinks that this is a person who's kind of poking their head around a tree at him. And it's daylight. He knows he's out in the middle of nowhere, but he's looking up at it. And he involuntarily cocks his head, like, huh? And this thing cocks its head. It's mimicking me. It steps out from behind the tree, and it's this huge, human-looking figure that looks very hairy. It's like 8 foot tall. And Jeff's looking up at it like, that's not a human. And so, not really sure what it is, he instinctively reaches for a sidearm, but he can't get it out of its holster. And he's like fumbling with it, and he's keeping his eyes on this thing that's, maybe 50 feet away from him, 20 feet up on this rocky outcropping. He can't get it out. And the figure's just looking down at him, and it's still got its head cocked to the side. He finally looks down to free his pistol. He draws the pistol, but the creature's gone. And he's like, I gotta get a better look. There was a tree that was pretty high that had a bunch of low branches that he could climb up. That would, if he climbed up maybe 15 or 20 feet, he could probably look over into this rocky outcropping. So he starts climbing up this tree, and he looks, and he's now level with that rocky outcropping, and he's looking out, and it stretches off quite a ways. There's a whole stretch of forest right there. And he's looking, and he can't see or hear anything. And he's starting to wonder to himself, like, did I really just see that? Is my mind playing tricks on me? Am I hallucinating? And so he decides, you know what? I'm going to climb back down, and I'm going to go up onto that rocky outcropping. Wasn't planning to, but now I'm going to, and I want to see if I can see some tracks or just see where this thing went. He's a Marine. He was a police officer. He was very comfortable in the wild. He just didn't really scare that easily. And so he's just kind of curious. And he's armed, And so he climbs down the tree and he starts climbing up this little rocky outcropping, and he gets up to where this creature was hiding. There's nothing there. There's no scent, there's no anything. And he just decides, you know what? I'm just gonna walk in the general direction that I think this thing went. Because where he was, which was this rocky outcropping, it kind of dead-ended because it's like a cliff. So he could pretty much only go inland and up this mountain. And so he just starts walking. And as he's walking, he's looking for signs that he could potentially attribute to this creature. He's listening really intently, but there's nothing. After about an hour, he's looking at the map and he's looking around at the terrain, and he's like, I think I'm lost. Like, I need to turn around now. And then it dawns on him that he's also lost track of time. It's starting to get pretty dark out, and he does not have a flashlight. So he starts to panic a little bit because he realizes that his curiosity has now put him in a very dangerous situation. He doesn't have supplies to stay the night. He doesn't have a flashlight. It's getting late, and he's potentially lost. So he tries to compose himself, and he just says, okay, I'm just going to turn around and walk back, because he hasn't seen any indication of this creature or this person or whatever it is. So he turns around and he starts backtracking as best as he can. And as soon as he starts moving back, from behind him, he hears what sounds like a very large tree break and smash into the ground. And he described it as being louder than most guns. Like, it's an extremely loud sound. And he turns around and he looks, and there's nothing there. But he just figured, that's crazy. Like, I'm lucky that no tree landed on me. He's not thinking that could be, Bigfoot. He's thinking that a tree just fell and I'm lucky it didn't land on me. And so now, even though he is not connecting the falling tree with this creature or person he saw, he's in a bit of a panicked state. And so he can't help but associate the experiences. And so he finds himself, as he's walking now a little bit faster and faster away from where he just was, looking over his shoulder in the direction of where that tree fell and where he believed this creature or person was. And as he's walking, looking ahead where he needs to go, but then peering over his head, over his shoulder, over and over again, he hears another loud snap and fall, and it stops him dead in his tracks. It was ahead of him, off to the right, basically on the exact opposite side of where he had come from. And he's thinking to himself, in all the time that I've spent in the woods, it's so rare to be around a tree suddenly falling, unless it's being caused by another tree falling or some other event. It's rare that you would hear two large trees break and fall independent from one another in the same small area but not connected. That's pretty rare. And he's thinking to himself, if that creature or person had anything to do with it, how did it go from over there to all the way over there without me hearing it? It's moving around without me being able to spot it. And so the hair on the back of his neck stands up and he's starting to feel very uncomfortable. He's being hunted. And so he keeps on walking the path, but begins to veer off away from the second snap that he heard. He figures, I'm just going to split the difference and kind of go a little bit to the left and avoid that falling tree, still keep my distance from this falling tree, and just get down the mountain as quickly as I can. And so as he starts moving in this kind of slightly new direction, he hears a third falling tree. And now it's back on his left side, closer to that first one he heard, except it's closer to him now. He turned around and he couldn't see the result of a large tree falling. He certainly heard it, but he's looking and he can't see anything. And he's thinking to himself, like, 3 falling trees, that is not innocent. Something is knocking over these trees. And I think it's that creature I saw. And even worse, as he's thinking to himself, is this creature using these trees to signal to other creatures where he is? Is he being tracked? It's getting closer to him without giving away its own position. He really believed he was being hunted. And so he starts sprinting down the mountain. And as he's running, he's hearing snap, fall, snap, fall. These massive trees are being knocked down on his left and his right side, like you have 2 hunters basically following him, or it's the same one that apparently can move around in the wilderness without being spotted. And he is absolutely terrified. He's running down the mountain, he's falling, he's getting smashed up every time he falls. And he finally, after about 30 minutes of just running straight downhill with these crashes getting closer and closer and closer to him, he reaches this clearing. And he stops abruptly because there's an animal in the middle of the clearing, and it's a deer. And the deer doesn't seem fazed by Jeff. The deer sees Jeff, looks behind Jeff, just off to his side, and it tilts its head back and then turns and sprints away. It wasn't running from Jeff. It was running from whatever was right behind Jeff. And Jeff stops, and he starts turning his head in the direction of where the deer was looking, and he can't see anything. And as he's looking, another tree slams, smashing down right behind where he was. He takes off sprinting. He knows he's maybe a half mile from his car at this point. And now, as he's sprinting through this field, all he hears is just a cascade of these crashing trees as he sprints the final stretch to his car. Pulls out his key and he starts clicking the automatic locks. And he can't tell if it's working. And he's panicking that it's not going to work in time and he's going to get to his car and it's going to be locked. He's fumbling with his keys to open the door. And now the crashing has all stopped. And he's just waiting for this thing to jump out and grab him. He manages to open his car, jumps inside, slams it, starts it up, and peels out of there. And then he went back to his office where his sheriff was, and he told him what happened, and he felt ridiculous telling him. And his sheriff was like, I get reports like this all the time. This side of the Cascade Mountains, in that very remote section that you were in, we get reports like that all the time. I believe you. If you want to file a report, go for it, but chances are good it's never going to be followed up with. This is just a phenomenon of being out here in the wilderness. Some people believe it, some people don't. Decades would go by and he would finally share his story, which is why we're hearing about it now. But when he tells that story, if you watch it on Paranormal Witness, you're listening to it like it happened yesterday. This has stuck with this man, and it's clear it had a profound impact on his life. So while there's never been any substantiated claims of Bigfoot actually existing, some of these reports are eerily similar to one another, and some of the people detailing these sightings are people like Jeff, who really has no reason to lie or embellish. He doesn't really stand to gain much. In fact, he stands to lose, because he could be labeled as kind of like a kook for believing that Bigfoot chased him. So the way I like to look at stuff like this is just to keep an open mind. We don't know half the stuff that's in our ocean. We barely know anything in the universe. What's to say that there isn't some creature like Bigfoot that's managed to evade, legitimate proof that it exists? I think it's certainly possible. It doesn't mean that I fundamentally believe it's true. It just means that I retain an open mind. But I want to know what you think chased Jeff through the woods. Was it Bigfoot? Was it something else? Or was this just some hoax? And if it was a hoax, are all the other sightings hoaxes too? And if you haven't already, if you enjoyed this story, if you would please gently disembowel the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3 to 4 weekly uploads of stories that are like this: strange, dark, and mysterious. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California, visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her apartment was part of this really safe complex. It was gated. There's lots of lights and cameras. So anything that went bump in the night was just going to be, your noisy neighbors or something. On the last night of Nathan's stay, he was laying in his bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the street lamp that was outside and the crickets and the passing by of cars, when he drifted off to sleep. At about 2 a.m., Nathan woke up, or so he thought. He couldn't move his body, he could only move his eyes, and even though he had never experienced sleep paralysis before, he instinctively understood this is probably that. He noticed the room was completely silent. There was no more crickets, no more hum of the light outside, no more traffic, just total silence. And then he started flashing his eyes around the room because he couldn't move his head or his body, and he started taking stock of the room. The bed he was in was positioned as far away from the door as he could in the back right corner. From where he was laying, if he looked to his right, in that corner was this big armoire, and then moving left from the armoire as he scanned the room, you'd come to the door, which is on the opposite side of where his bed was, and then if he kept scanning left, he would reach the foot of his bed, and just beyond the foot of his bed was a table and a chair. But because he was laying flat, he couldn't really look down and actually see the table and chair. And so with all of his strength, he managed to raise his head just enough that he had a line of sight to that section of his room, the only section he has not looked at yet. And he sees the table and chair, and he sees in the corner is this dark figure that's standing there looking at him. He's completely frozen with fear. His thought is, there's an intruder in the house. How did they get in here? What are they doing in here? And he managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure, and he determined it was most likely a woman with a shawl covering her face. And before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of view. And then Nathan's head fell back, and now he knows there's just some stranger in his room, and he can't lift his head up anymore, and he's looking around with his eyes. He sees the armoire, he sees the door, he can't see that table and chair, and then he hears the sound of someone slithering along the ground out of view, and he can hear her breathing as she's getting closer and closer to the edge of the bed. And he's laying there terrified. He's so scared he can't even make a sound, and he's telling himself this has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. And he's laying there, and this woman, she stands up and she leans out over his bed, and she looks at him, and her face is pale and her eyes are sunk way back in her head. And then she begins to slowly crawl on top of him, and Nathan's sitting here looking at this woman. He wants to close his eyes, but he can't. Then he just feels his chest being pressed down. He can hear the sounds of the springs compressing all around him as this woman positions herself on his chest. And then he finally manages to let out a scream, and then suddenly he's awake. The woman's gone. And he sits up and he's looking around. There's nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the light and the crickets and the traffic outside, they all return. And his mom comes running in the room, and she's like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." And he said, "Oh, no, I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." And his mom's like, "Okay, all right, you need anything?" And he's like, "Nope, So she comes over, she gives him a hug and a kiss, she goes back to bed, and he would go downstairs, flip on a Disney movie, actually Aladdin, and he would fall asleep with a Disney movie on and with lights on. And there was no more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and he headed back to his house, and he couldn't shake the experience. He had never had sleep paralysis before, but it was just so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. And he's just thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people that put up with this on any sort of regular basis. But, after a couple of days and getting home and not experiencing any sleep paralysis, time went on and he just kind of forgot about it. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan is at this big family party in Chico, California, big outdoor barbecue, all of his family's there. And at some point, his sister shows up. His sister was not supposed to be attending this party, so it was a great surprise. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he immediately pulls her aside to catch up with her. And so for the first hour of their conversation, they're just chatting about their lives and what they're up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to share his sleep paralysis experience with his sister. And the reason he wanted to was because he knew that she knew that he was actually a skeptic. And so she would believe him. If he's telling her this is what happened, she would believe that that's what he saw. And so he starts by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment just a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. And his sister immediately butts in and she goes, wait a minute. I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room and then I saw this woman and she was like standing on me. I thought I was going to die. It was horrible. That's exactly what happened to me. I was laying in the guest room and I couldn't move. And then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. And at the end of it, they wanted to have a rational explanation for how they both could just somehow have their only sleep paralysis experience in the same room in roughly the same timeline and experience the exact same events. They were trying to, come up with a rational explanation for that, but it was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them were really prepared to start discussing what else it could be. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off and say, man, that's pretty weird. And they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan would go back to his house and he would tell his wife about this crazy coincidence he and his sister had. And his wife would say, yeah, that's wild. But after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it. And so he kind of just, pushed it out of his mental space and did forget about it. He moved on. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom would move out of that apartment building and she would move into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove, California. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come spend a couple nights with her, and Nathan said sure. In order to better understand what happens to Nathan over the course of his stay at his mother's new house, you need to understand a basic layout of her house. So when you walk through her double doors, to your left is going to be a formal living room. In the center of the house is a hallway that shoots straight back to the kitchen. And then to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall is the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs to the second floor, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks back into the backyard, and immediately to your right, there is a single door, and that's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turned left, there'd be another door that's a mirror image of the master bedroom door, and this door is the guest room. That's where Nathan was going to stay. And then to the left of the guest room was a hall that went to the front of the house, but that's irrelevant to the story. If you went inside the guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, so the same layout as the guest room in the apartment building, where the person laying in the bed, so Nathan, his feet would be closest to the door. And from Nathan's perspective in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new house guest room was a table that was, from his perspective, on the right-hand wall, centered on the wall, and on the table was a TV. So that's the only things in the room. The first night Nathan was at this new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, laying on the bed, watching TV. The lights are off, it's just the TV on, and at some point, he dozes off. He wakes up a short time later, and he can't move. It's the same sensation he had when he was staying with his mom at her apartment. And he begins to panic because the last time he felt this way, a strange veiled woman stood on his chest and made it feel like he was dying. And so immediately, he's trying to move his body, he can't, and so using his eyes, he starts looking around the room, praying this woman is not in the room with him. And so he looks to the right, to that corner, which he can see. There's no one there. From this corner, he starts scanning across the room, He sees the TV, it's still on. He keeps scanning and he sees the door and it's open. And he's able to just barely make out the space at the foot of the bed. He can actually see to the corner, and this woman, she's not in here. And so initially he feels incredibly relieved that she's not in the room with him. But then he finds himself focusing on the open door into the dark hallway. And he's thinking to himself, please do not come walking through that door. And so he stares at the open door, just hoping he breaks out of this sleep paralysis when he notices something about the TV. It's flickering. And so he averts his gaze to the TV and he realizes what he's looking at on TV does not look familiar. It does not look like a TV show. It looks like CCTV camera footage, like it looks like a security camera footage. And he realizes the footage he's looking at is the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the way it was laid out. That's his mother's house. That's downstairs. And he's staring at the footage thinking, why is this footage playing on the TV? And I don't think there's a camera down there. When he notices on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame. And she looks up at the camera right as the camera turns off. And then the room is completely dark. There's no more ambient light in the room. The hallway is dark. And he's left paralyzed knowing this woman is downstairs in the kitchen. And as he's laying there, he hears her start running through the house. And it sounds like an animal is barreling into things as she's running through the bottom floor. And she stops at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. And so as he's laying there, he feels his heart racing and he's staring at the open door. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs and she's going to come through that door. And instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one step. Two-step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, he's just thinking, please break out of this trance. Stop this paralysis. Wake up, wake up. And then he sees her head emerge and she turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around and starts charging into the room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is scared for his life as this woman is charging towards him and she stops dead in her tracks right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was downstairs, Nathan could sit up. Except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's apartment when he sat up and he had the sensation of relief. You've woken up. You were asleep before. Now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he can sit up. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled. She's half asleep. And she's like, was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her and he can't even process what he's been through, whether that was real, whether it was a dream. And he's trying to find the words to describe to his mom the dream he had, but like he can't process what's happening. And he just says, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. And so the two of them flip on every light upstairs. They're not even talking. At this point, it's survival mode. They turn on all the lights upstairs, and Nathan leads the way down, and they're flicking on all the lights, and they manage to search the whole house, and there's no sign of a break-in. There's no one in their house. After the coast was clear, and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to kind of talk about what just happened. And so Nathan's like, okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. So a few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was laying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room, and they were standing on me. It was terrifying, but it sounded an awful lot like sleep paralysis. But then a couple months after that, I talked to my sister and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that room and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we basically had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who was running around the house, and you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She says to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment way long time ago, but I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, showed up in the room and she stood on me, and it scared the heck out of me, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought it was sleep paralysis. And so Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could they, all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan, he was in the bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her bedroom. And she didn't have any pets, so who could it be? Nathan says he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last experience Nathan had, and they're just hoping it stays that way. At around 5 o'clock in the evening on June 25th, 1999, a man named Ricky McCormick stumbled into an emergency room in St. Louis, Missouri, with his hand over his chest, complaining that he couldn't breathe. He said he had asthma, and earlier that day he had been cutting the grass, and so maybe that had caused a flare-up. But either way, here he was in a lot of discomfort saying, I need help. Ricky was 41 years old, and for his whole life, he had had heart and lung problems, and so him arriving in this state in the ER was actually not all that uncommon for him. And so this hospital did what they did with anyone who came in complaining that they couldn't breathe. They immediately took Ricky to a back exam room, and they hooked him up to all these monitors to make sure his heartbeat was steady and that his oxygen levels were plenty high. And once Ricky was in the exam room getting hooked up, he started acting really agitated, and he kept looking around the room like he was scared that someone was going to jump out at him. And he was also sweating profusely, and whenever he did speak, he spoke so quickly no one could really understand him. But despite Ricky's odd behavior, the heart monitor showed his heart was beating steadily, his oxygen levels were perfectly fine, and when the doctor came in and examined Ricky, even though he clearly saw that something was off about Ricky, there wasn't any sign that there was anything physically wrong with Ricky. And so the doctor and the nurses agreed that whatever was going on with Ricky had to be psychological. And as it happened, Ricky did have a long history of psychological issues. He was known for making things up all the time, just telling people these crazy stories about himself, like how he was this talented singer and he was about to go on tour, or that he was actually a prince, or that he was studying to be a doctor. I mean, things that nobody thought was true, but Ricky would say as if this is just common knowledge. This is who I am. And so Ricky's family for the longest time had just assumed that Ricky was either bipolar or maybe schizophrenic. Those are both serious mental health disorders that totally disrupt normal thinking. But Ricky, despite being encouraged by his friends and family to go get help, never got help for any of his psychological issues. And so Ricky's life had kind of gone off the rails. He had dropped out of high school and not gone back to any sort of schooling, and he had spent some time in jail. Now, Ricky was living in a low-income, very dangerous part of St. Louis, which is a big Midwestern city on the Mississippi River that in 1999 had a very serious issue with gang violence. Ricky absolutely hated it there, but he had no way to actually leave St. Louis. In fact, Ricky didn't even have his own place. He bounced around from his mother's place, his aunt's place, and his girlfriend's place. Ricky did work, but the work was very sporadic, and it was for the most part just night shifts for random odd jobs. And when Ricky was actually working, he really just spent his time chain smoking cigarettes and drinking literally gallons of coffee. Back at the ER, Ricky, who was still in the exam room, had only been there for less than an hour when the doctor came back in and told Ricky that he was okay and he was going to be discharged. Now, Ricky immediately said, no, I have to be here tonight. I need to stay here. You need to admit me. But the doctor just kind of ignored what he said and handed him the discharge paperwork. 15 minutes later, when a nurse came back into the exam room to get this paperwork from Ricky, she would walk in and see Ricky still sitting on the exam bed, kind of fidgeting around, looking down at this paperwork on his lap that immediately she saw he had not filled out. He had just signed his name at the bottom. And when she walked in, Ricky looked up at her and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and looked at her and was like, I don't know how to read or write. Can you help me? And so the nurse immediately felt bad for Ricky. I mean, he's got dirty clothes on, he looks thin and frail, he's clearly very down on his luck, there's some issues happening with this guy, and he can't even fill out his discharge paperwork. And so she said, no problem. She sat down with him, and together they filled out his paperwork. And then afterwards, when she walked him out of the exam room back to the front of the hospital, Ricky turned to her and said, instead of going home, can you just let me stay here in the lobby just for tonight? And this nurse, who knew she was not allowed to do this, she looked around and saw it was not a busy night there. And so she said, okay, as long as you don't bother anyone, you can stay here. And so Ricky thanked her repeatedly and then walked over to the corner, kind of far away from the front desk and far away from the front door. And he sat down and folded his arms, and then he just stared at the front door. And so this nurse assumed that Ricky actually must be homeless, especially based on, how he came in and how he was acting. And so she figured, he needs a place that's warm to stay tonight. And so the nurse went back to her station, and over the course of the next several hours, she would periodically look out into the lobby, expecting to see Ricky kind of curled up asleep in the corner. But every time she looked out there, Ricky was still sitting upright, arms folded, staring at the front door of the hospital as if he was expecting someone to come in at any moment and he needed to be ready. And so she thought this was unusual, but she decided not to intervene. She just let him sit there and do his thing. Later that morning at 11:30 a.m., when the nice nurse who had allowed Ricky to stay in the lobby was leaving her shift, another crew of nurses came in, and right away they noticed Ricky was just sitting in the corner for no apparent reason. And when they walked up to him to ask if he was okay, what are you doing here? What can we do for you? Ricky, instead of trying to talk to any of these nurses, just got up and walked out of the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Ricky walked to a nearby payphone and he called his girlfriend, Sandy. And when Sandy picked up the phone, she immediately recognized her boyfriend's very familiar voice, but she also picked up that he sounded really tired and kind of out of it. And so when she asked him, are you okay? What's going on? Ricky would tell her that he had just spent the night in the hospital. But he didn't clarify that he had spent the night in the lobby of the hospital, not admitted as a patient at the hospital. But to Sandy, it really didn't matter because already this was raising red flags for her, because this was actually the second time that Ricky had gone to the ER just that week. Just a few days earlier, Ricky had been released from a different hospital in St. Louis after telling doctors there that he had had these chest pains and he couldn't breathe. And so he had been admitted for a couple of days, but ultimately they determined that there really was nothing wrong with him. And they too believed whatever was happening with him had to be psychological. And so he had been released. Additionally, Sandy had been growing increasingly worried about Ricky because over the last several weeks, Ricky had begun acting really paranoid, to the point where anytime he was in her apartment and somebody outside the apartment just walked down the hallway, Ricky would jump as if he was worried whoever was out there was going to barge in at any moment. But whenever Sandy asked Ricky, what's going on? Why are you so paranoid? He refused to elaborate. So, feeling very concerned about Ricky, on this phone call, Sandy would say to Ricky, please come to my apartment and let me take care of you. If you're not feeling well, I'll make you feel better. Just please come to my apartment right now. But Ricky said no, he did not want to go to Sandy's apartment. He told her instead he was going to walk to a nearby gas station to get a bite to eat, and then afterwards he would give Sandy a call. And so the two of them agreed to this plan. They hung up. But then Ricky did not call Sandy later. A worker at the gas station where Ricky said he was going would later tell authorities that Ricky did come into the gas station and he got a hot dog on that day, the 26th. And then the next day, this same worker said, yep, we saw Ricky again on the 27th. He came in here, he got a bite to eat, and then he left. But after that, nobody saw Ricky. Not his aunt, not his mom, not his girlfriend. He didn't show up in any other emergency rooms in Missouri. He just disappeared. On June 30th, so 3 days after Ricky was last seen at this gas station, a woman was driving her car 20 miles north of St. Louis on this highway when she looked out into this cornfield that butted up against the highway, and she saw kind of in the middle of it was this dark shape that looked totally out of place. And so she was intrigued enough that she actually pulled over on the road. She got out and began walking into this cornfield to see what this thing was. And when she got up to this thing and saw what it was, she froze in horror, and then she screamed, turned around, and ran back to her car, and she flew to the nearest gas station. She grabbed a payphone and she called 911.
When the police arrived at this cornfield, they too walked out towards this dark thing, and then finally they saw what this thing was that had scared this woman. It was a dead person who was lying face down. Their body was very badly decomposed. And in fact, their body was just kind of falling apart. Like the fingers of this person's body had just kind of crumpled off of their hands. Now, based on what this person was wearing, they appeared to be male, but there was no way to tell how this person died or really how long they had been dead for. But despite the advanced decomposition, authorities were able to get a good fingerprint, and it would turn out that this body belonged to Ricky McCormick. The day after Ricky's body was found, the police would come out and say they were treating his death as a homicide. This area along this highway in this cornfield was actually a fairly common place for murderers to dump their victims. And it was very unlikely that Ricky had gotten there by himself. He didn't have a car. In fact, he didn't even have a driver's license. There was no public transportation that could have brought him to this spot. And if Ricky had decided to walk to this area for some reason, it was a solid 15 miles from where he lived and worked. Also, Ricky's body was way too decomposed relative to when he had last been seen alive, just 3 days earlier. And so there was a theory that perhaps he was killed somewhere else and then kept indoors in heat, and that had accelerated his decomposition, and then at some point whoever had killed him had moved his body and dumped it in this cornfield. And so on that first day of the homicide investigation, July 1st, the police put 18 detectives, so a ton of detectives, on this case, and they also appealed to the public to come forward if you had any information about what could have happened to Ricky McCormick. But just a day later, on July 2nd, the police came out and made an announcement that, after looking at all the evidence and looking at Ricky's body again, it did not appear, in fact, that he had been murdered, but instead he must have died of natural causes. This is a guy that had lung and heart problems, and so that is likely what killed him. Case closed. And so after this announcement, all of the evidence in Ricky's case was bundled up, put into storage, and people just kind of forgot about it. 6 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, got a tip that involved Ricky McCormick. They were working on a case in St. Louis, Missouri about this major drug dealer who apparently was ordering hits on his rivals, and a confidential informant came forward and told the FBI that this guy, Ricky McCormick, had gotten wrapped up with this major drug dealer. But they didn't really know what role Ricky was playing with this drug dealer. It was just kind of a rumor on the street that, Ricky was involved somehow. This did not make any sense to the FBI because they're thinking, why would this big-time drug dealer who really was a mover and shaker in St. Louis get involved with this guy, Ricky McCormick, who was obviously deeply mentally ill and borderline homeless? I mean, what role could Ricky play for this drug dealer? But the FBI still did follow up on this tip because it was very credible, and when they spoke to the local police who had investigated Ricky's death, they got Ricky's file, which meant they got all of the evidence, and immediately the FBI realized the local police had overlooked a very strange piece of evidence found in Ricky's pocket. This strange evidence was quickly sent to FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, and it landed on the desk of a forensic analyst named Dan Olson. Dan was relatively new to the FBI, but he was highly disciplined and very methodical. And so when he received this piece of evidence, he got to work right away trying to figure out what it was, what it meant in relationship to Ricky and this drug dealer, and, maybe does it answer the question of how these people are connected. But despite his best efforts in calling in the experts and using every computer program to analyze this evidence, he just could not figure out what it meant. At the same time that Dan was doing this, the big drug dealer who was the target of that big FBI investigation in St. Louis was arrested on gun and drug charges, and so the big case was now over. And suddenly, trying to figure out what connection Ricky McCormick had to this drug dealer was kind of irrelevant, because the drug dealer was behind bars and Ricky was already dead. And so the FBI kind of put a pause on trying to figure out what this evidence was. And so Dan, even though he was really curious now, he was fully invested in trying to figure out what this thing was, he realized he had to give it up too and move on to something else. And so the strange evidence went back into storage, and once again, everyone just kind of moved on from Ricky McCormick. But Dan never really forgot about this mystifying piece of evidence. It was always in the back of his mind. 22 years later, Dan Olson had now become very senior at the FBI. He was actually in charge of their cryptanalysis and racketeering unit. Basically, he was in charge of the people at the FBI who specialized in code breaking, meaning they were the people that would pull any sort of secret messages embedded inside of evidence. And so at some point after taking over this unit, Dan pulled out of storage this strange piece of evidence connected to Ricky McCormick. And he said, you know what? I just need to know what this means. I have to figure it out. I've never been able to. It's haunted me ever since. And so Dan went public. He went to the media and he asked the world to take a look at this mystifying piece of evidence and come forward if you have any idea what it means. When Ricky was discovered in that cornfield, the local police quickly emptied his pockets, and in his pants pocket were 2 documents that contained an incredibly complex cipher or code. It was basically 30 lines on each piece of paper with different symbols and letters and capital letters. I mean, it looked like total gibberish to the untrained eye. But to people like Dan and his code-breaking team, these symbols and letters could mean there was a secret message hidden inside of these documents if you could break the code system. But of course, no one could ever break that code. So how in the world does a guy like Ricky, who is basically functionally illiterate and can only write his name, he's clearly mentally ill and he's not really in touch with reality all the time, how does a guy like that come to be in possession of these complex ciphers? And if he didn't write these ciphers, because that's possible, maybe somebody else gave them to Ricky, well, why would anyone who came up with this very complex cipher entrust a guy like Ricky to be the one to carry these things around? I mean, presumably, they contain confidential information that's been very carefully hidden inside of the cipher. And so why give it to Ricky? He's such a liability. And also, what happened to Ricky in that cornfield? I mean, we don't even know how he got there. We don't know how he was killed. All we know is that he had these ciphers in his pocket when he was found. And so many people believe, including law enforcement, that the answer to, what happened to Ricky and what was his connection to this drug lord in St. Louis, if any, or, what was he up to, will all be solved if we can just figure out what these 2 ciphers mean. But as of right now, no one has solved the riddle of what these 2 ciphers mean. All we know is that Ricky McCormick, a couple of weeks before he died, became increasingly paranoid and was so scared of someone or something that he was likely running into these hospitals just to hide out. But eventually, whoever or whatever Ricky was scared of very likely caught up to him and killed him. But until we crack these ciphers, we very likely will have no idea what actually happened to Ricky McCormick. Today, the FBI has set up a special website where you can look at these 2 ciphers that Ricky had in his pocket, and if you're able to crack them, because someone's going to eventually, you can tell the FBI through this website and potentially help solve Ricky's murder. To go to this FBI website, click the link in the description below.
In 2006, a 20-year-old woman named Sarah started having some very strange dreams about a woman named Aurora. She had a very striking face with sharp features and long black hair. Now, her dreams varied. Sometimes Sarah was in a crowd of people, or she was at her office, or she was just alone in a room. But in all of her dreams, Aurora would always show up. Either she would interact with Aurora and they would speak, but Sarah could never remember what they actually spoke about, or Aurora would just be in the crowd or in the background just watching Sarah. Now, she had these dreams enough that eventually Sarah began to think, I must know someone named Aurora. I must have come across this person, and now they're just kind of manifesting in my brain at night when I'm sleeping. And so she began going through her older posts on social media to look in pictures of her and of her friends to see if there was a woman with striking features and long black hair that was this Aurora person in her dream. But after looking through hundreds and hundreds of pictures, she couldn't find any indication that she had met this person, at least not according to her social media. And so Sarah began just going on Google and typing in Aurora, long black hair, striking features. Has anybody dreamed about this? To see if there were people talking about having this type of dream on the internet. But she had no luck. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 months of having these strange dreams that Aurora was in, Aurora stopped showing up in Sarah's dreams. It was like it suddenly was all over. And so very quickly, Sarah just kind of forgot about it. A few years later, on Halloween night 2009, Sarah and a friend pulled off the highway into a gas station. They had been out with some friends celebrating Halloween, and now they were making their way back home. Sarah pulled into an empty spot right in front of the convenience store, and after they were parked, Sarah and her friend got out, they went inside, they got some snacks and drinks, and then they came back outside and climbed back into Sarah's car. A few moments later, Sarah had turned her car on, she had backed out, and she had driven past all of the gas station pumps, and she was making her way towards the single-lane strip of road that merged out onto the highway. It was how anybody who got into this gas station got back out onto the highway. And so as she's getting closer to the entrance of this short merge road, her phone suddenly rings. What happens next occurred over a span of just a few seconds. So it might seem like this is over several minutes, but this all happened pretty much simultaneously. So she's pulling up to the entrance of this merge road, her cell phone rings, and because there was no one behind her, it was not a busy night, Sarah decides to just stop her car, put it in park so she can safely take this phone call. And so she stops her car pretty much right in front of the entrance to this merge road, and she picks up her phone, she looks at the number, and she doesn't recognize it, but she picks it up anyways, and she says, "Hello." There was silence on her phone, and as Sarah is saying, "Hello, is anybody there?" another car from the gas station pulls up right behind Sarah's car, and they start honking their horn immediately. They're in a huge rush. And so Sarah, who's totally embarrassed that she's blocking traffic, she hangs up the phone, she puts it down, she puts her car back in drive, and she hits the gas. But this driver behind her is apparently in such a rush, they're so impatient, that they actually swerved around her, driving on the dirt off to the side of the road just to get around her, and then they sped off down the merge road back onto the highway. And literally, seconds later, another car that was already on the highway, a silver Honda Civic, lost control and smashed into this car that had just passed Sarah's car. So there's this huge car accident literally right in front of Sarah and her friend, who have now stopped the car. They're right at the end of the merge road looking at this horrible accident that they narrowly escaped. Sarah put her car back in park, she picked up her phone, and she called the police. When the police showed up a few moments later, they took down Sarah and her friend's version of events, and then a little while later, after the ambulances had left and after the two cars had been pulled off of the highway, one of the police officers pulled Sarah aside and told her that the driver of the Honda Civic and the driver of the car that had swerved around her had both been killed in the accident. Shocked, the only thing Sarah could think to do was to call back that number she didn't recognize that had effectively stopped her from getting onto the highway and maybe even stopped her from being hit by that Honda Civic. And so she wanted to talk to this person and thank them for saving her life. But when she called the number back, the person did not pick up. However, it went to her voicemail, and it said, "Hi, you've reached Aurora. Leave your name and number after the beep." Sarah could not believe it. She said she had never felt goosebumps like that in her entire life. The next day, Sarah tried calling the number again, and this time the woman, Aurora, answered the phone. The two got to talking, and Sarah explained her crazy dreams and now this crazy car crash thing and how it's all connected. And Aurora would tell Sarah, like, "That's amazing. This is a crazy story you're telling me, except I didn't call you last night. I have no idea how you got my phone number." And so at the end of this phone call, the two women really had not reached any sort of explanation for how this came to be, how they came to be talking. But they ultimately just said, "Okay, hey, thanks and best of luck to you." And then they hung up. After the call was over, Sarah found herself just kind of sitting there, not really sure how to react to what had just happened. It was such a totally bizarre thing that she had just been through over the past 24 hours. And then if you include the dream, this has been a multi-year long thing. And so on a whim, Sarah just opens up her Facebook account and she plugs in Aurora's full name because Aurora had given her full name on this phone call they had just had. And when she looked at her phone, when the results came in, Sarah nearly fainted. Right at the top of the results page was this woman, Aurora's Facebook account, and her profile picture showed her face. And when Sarah looked at her face, it was the exact same face she had seen so many times in her dreams. It was the same Aurora with the striking features and long black hair. The woman in her dreams was the woman who called her and saved her life. On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels, and, Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards the stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping. It was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to, and he feels himself. He's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open, and he climbed out of his car, and he looked a little ways down the road, and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side, and it was hissing steam, and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck, and so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was, and then before the guy could do anything, the sliding door to the van flung open, and this woman with blonde hair jumped out, and she ran over to him, and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman, and he's kind of sizing her up, and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van,
van, and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair, and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman, and the old woman's looking right back, and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, you know what, I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet. The woman just nodded, and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out, and she rushed over to the truck, and she climbed on top of it, and she reached down, and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van, and the white van sped off down the road, and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, well, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him, and so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically, meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Soma Sierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately loads of sightings were reported of Juan. But every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear. And the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the U.S. Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid and just didn't say anything and kind of just stepped back like this, like he wasn't going to answer. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found, he's still missing, and his case is still unsolved. On the afternoon of June 15th, 1988, a man named Keith Reinard drove down the main street of a tiny town called Silver Plume, which is located in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In his car was everything Keith would need to live for the next 3 months. Silver Plume was the kind of place that most people would just pass by on the highway without even considering stopping. It was kind of a no-name town in the middle of nowhere. In the 1800s, it had been a booming mining town. However, now all but 140 of its residents had either died or moved away. In fact, Silver Plume was considered a living ghost town because of how close it was to being totally abandoned. But this emptiness and kind of middle of nowhere-ness was exactly what appealed to Keith about this town. Keith was 49 years old and lived over 1,000 miles away to the east in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And Keith had a great life. He was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He had a good job working for a newspaper covering high school sports, and he had a beautiful house. But for Keith, he felt like as good as his life looked on paper, it was missing something. There was one thing he had always wanted to do, but had always put off doing, and that was to write a book. And not just any book, a book that lots of people were going to read, a great American classic. That's what he wanted to make. But there was just one problem. Keith had no idea what this big book was going to be about. And that was why he had come to Silver Plume. Keith had taken a 3-month leave from his job and left his wife and his kids and the city all behind to come out to this town to hopefully, in this new, peaceful, quiet environment, find the inspiration he really needed to not only discover what this book would be about, but to sit down and actually write it. Keith's wife had not been happy about this plan, him kind of being gone for 3 months, not providing any income, not helping with the kids. But she could tell Keith really felt like he needed to do this, and so she gave him her blessing. After arriving on Main Street in Silver Plume, Keith looked up and he saw KP Cafe off to the right. It was a weathered old building that looked like it was straight out of a cowboy movie, and this cafe was exactly the landmark that Keith had been looking for. And so he pulled his car over on the side of the road, he got out, he stretched, and then he began walking towards this cafe. This cafe was the big hangout spot in Silver Plume for all of its 140 residents, and the reason Keith knew this was because his best friend from high school, Ted Parker, owned KP Cafe. Ted had actually been the person who inspired Keith to come to Silver Plume in the first place. He had told him about how peaceful and serene this place was, the best environment for a writer. And when Keith had told Ted that sounds great, I'm going to do it, I'm going to come to Silver Plume, Ted had told him that he also owned the store right next to KP Cafe that used to be a bookstore, but the previous tenant who ran the bookstore had talked about some big European vacation he was going on and then had just kind of vanished. And so for months now, this storefront had been vacant. And so Ted had told Keith that while he was in town, he was more than welcome to work and write out of this vacant bookshop. And so Keith, after walking up to the front window of KP Cafe, he looked inside and didn't see Ted, and so he decided he would take a moment and walk over to this vacant bookshop that would be his office. So he went next door, he pulled out the key that Ted had already sent him in advance, he unlocked the door, and he went inside. And right away, Keith was struck at what he saw. I mean, the place was full of books. Some piles of books were higher than his head, and many of the books looked rare and expensive. And Keith's first thought was, why did this guy who used to run this store just abandon all of this? This had to cost a lot of money. But Keith was far too excited about the next few months and getting this book done that he didn't really think too hard about whatever the previous owner had done. And instead, he just began to daydream about what the next few months would be like and how this book was going to turn out. And as Keith was thinking about his big book project, Ted actually came into the bookstore, and when the two friends saw each other, they ran up to each other and embraced, and then before long, the two of them had gone outside and began walking around Silver Plume, just chatting and catching up. And eventually, after chatting and walking around for a really long time, the pair left Silver Plume and wound up walking onto this hiking trail that went up into the woods. Now, years earlier, Ted and Keith had both been avid hikers and outdoorsmen, but now, I mean, Keith had put on some weight and he really wasn't a big hiker anymore, but Ted didn't really know that. And so Ted, he's leading this hike up this trail as they're still kind of chatting and making light of things. But Keith, as he was struggling to keep up, was getting more and more anxious about this hike. And he also had a deep fear of heights. And this trail appeared to go really high up this mountain. But Keith kept telling himself that, he was here in Silver Plume as much to write this book as he was to kind of have a little more adventure in his life. And so he just kept on trudging along after Ted. But eventually, Keith just could not handle how high up they were getting. He was totally terrified of being able to see the valley way down below. And so he had a sort of panic attack where he lunged and grabbed a nearby tree and hugged it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling off the mountain. And when Ted turned around and saw Keith, he rushed over to him and said, "Don't worry, everything is okay." He convinced him to let go of the tree, and then very carefully, Keith and Ted walked back down the trail back into town. And when they got down there, Ted would tell Keith he was so sorry for putting Keith in such a stressful position, and Keith kind of brushed it off and said, it's totally fine, no big deal. Even though this panic attack was very embarrassing for Keith, he wound up just kind of shifting his mental focus to getting settled into this new life he was going to be living for the next few months. And so along with this office space in this old abandoned bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town. And very quickly, Keith developed a sort of daily routine. He would get up early in his apartment and he would make his way over to the bookstore and he would sit down at his computer and he would write all day. But even though Keith was doing a lot of writing, it was not productive writing. It was mostly Keith sitting down, trying to come up with the topic for his book, not being able to do it, and then he just sort of drifted off and began doing journal entries and writing snippets of poetry, and then before long the day was over and he had accomplished nothing. And so at the end of June, roughly 2 weeks after Keith had arrived in town, he was sitting at his computer one morning inside of the bookshop, unable to write anything productive. and he told himself, you know what, I gotta do something to break out of this writer's block. Writer's block is when writers kind of hit a psychological wall and just can't seem to be creative. They can't write. And so Keith decided, in order to kind of get out of this funk, that he would go back up into the mountains again. He would face his fear of heights, and he would get to the summit, and that clean mountain air and all the nature around him would kind of bring him back to reality and give him the inspiration he would need to just write this book. And so Keith turned off his computer, he left the bookstore, he went back to his apartment in the church, he packed some sandwiches and some water into a backpack, and then he walked from the church apartment to the nearby trail that would lead out of Silver Plume and up into the forest and into the mountains. It was a hot day that day, but as soon as Keith was underneath the shade of all the trees, it was very cool, and the sounds of the birds and the insects and other animals all around him was very calming. But very quickly, Keith's hike went from very peaceful and relatively flat to very intimidating and very steep. But Keith, he was determined to do this hike. He felt like it was a critical step in the creation of this book. And so he just kept on going one foot after another, huffing and panting and making his way up this incredibly steep trail. And it was like with every step he took, he felt braver and braver. And suddenly he was able to look down at the valley below and not feel as frightened. And then at some point, as he was walking up, he saw all these scratch marks on a tree that were obviously from a mountain lion. But instead of Keith feeling scared, he felt more brave. He felt excited. He felt like this is what he came here for. This book and adventure kind of coming together in this moment. Finally, Keith made it to the top of this trail, and he found this incredible clearing that looked down over the town below. And in this clearing was a monument to a man named Clifford Griffin, who had died at this exact spot 100 years earlier. Keith knew Clifford's story. Back in 1887, when Silver Plume was a booming mining town, Clifford, who was a mine owner, came up to this exact spot in the mountains to play his violin. And then after playing it for a bit, he stopped and dug a grave, stood on the edge of it, shot himself, and fell into the hole. No one knew why he did that, but within a couple of years, the mining industry came to a halt in Silver Plume, and everybody just kind of vanished. And very quickly, rumors began to swirl around the people who remained in Silver Plume, how, their town must be cursed, and maybe it was connected to what happened to poor old Clifford. After staring at this monument for a few minutes, Keith turned his attention to lunch. He pulled off his backpack, took out a sandwich, and he began eating. And as he ate, he looked back at this monument and he thought of another strange Silver Plume story, except this one hit much closer to home. It was about the man who used to run the bookstore where Keith now did all of his writing out of. This man's name was Tom Young, and it would turn out what Keith had heard about Tom when Keith first arrived in Silver Plume was not entirely correct. Keith had been told that Tom had been talking about this European vacation, and so the consensus was that, he had left town and gone to Europe and just not come back. But the reality was, once Keith began asking around a little bit over those first couple of weeks he was there, was that Tom actually had been talking about this big European vacation, but then had walked into the woods, up into the mountains, where Keith was right now, where this monument was, and Tom had just vanished, apparently, in these mountains. Tom apparently had been a very quirky guy who had come to Silver Plume in the 1970s to kind of start a new life for himself. He had been teaching high school students in Denver, but he apparently didn't really like doing that and wanted to start over, and so that was what drew him to Silver Plume. And in Silver Plume, residents always saw Tom, along with his best friend, Gus, his black Labrador retriever, walking around town playing fetch. But instead of using a ball, Tom would throw a chewed-up doll's head. And then on September 7th, 1987, so roughly 9 months before Keith arrived in Silver Plume, Tom and his dog Gus had gone for a hike in the woods where Keith was, and then vanished. Now, at first, people assumed that because Tom had been talking a lot about going on this European vacation right before he vanished, that must be where he went. But when people checked his shop, they saw all of his books were still in there. It did not appear like he had packed things up. And when the sheriff looked into it, he couldn't find any evidence that Tom had ever bought any plane tickets to go to Europe. And so no one really knew what happened to Tom. It was like this big mystery. And so as Keith was standing in this clearing near this monument, thinking about Tom and his story, Keith began to realize there were a lot of similarities between him, Keith, and Tom. They both, as adults, had come to Silver Plume, this kind of random place in the middle of Colorado, to get a sort of second chance in life. And they both worked out of the exact same storefront. And Keith had done some additional digging on Tom when he heard about this mystery and learned that they were almost the exact same age. Their birthdays were separated by 1 day. Also, Keith discovered that he and Tom had served in the military at almost the exact same time in the 1960s. And so as Keith was going over all these strange coincidences and weird similarities between his life and Tom's, suddenly Keith stopped chewing his sandwich and just quickly packed everything back up. He turned and began running down the trail, going back towards town. And as he ran, Keith smiled because he realized he had just discovered what his great American classic novel was going to be about. It was going to be about Tom. For the entire month of July, all Keith did was write. He was in his office 7 days a week typing away, and then at night when he went back to his apartment, his neighbors would see the lights on all night long. At the end of July, so by this point Keith has been living in Silver Plume for about a month and a half, 2 hunters from Silver Plume began hiking up that same mountain trail that led up into the mountains and into the forest that Keith had gone on recently and found his inspiration for his novel. And so these 2 hunters, they're making their way up the trail, and at some point they leave the marked trail and begin kind of meandering through the trees. And as they're walking, they're kind of looking for a clearing to set up for the day. And at one point, one of the hunters happens to look up and he sees there's this really bright white thing sitting at the base of a tree in a clearing. And so these 2 hunters make their way up to this bright white thing, and as soon as they're looking down at it, they realize they have very likely stumbled on a crime scene. At their feet was this green tarp that was partially exposing this white skeleton underneath. And when they pulled back the green tarp a little bit, they saw it was a human skeleton and a dog skeleton kind of lying next to each other as if the 2 of them had lied down and died there. But what was immediately apparent to these 2 hunters is that both the human skull and the dog skull had gaping holes in them, like they had been shot. And several feet away from the skeletons was a rusted pistol. And so these 2 hunters, after staring at the scene in front of them for a couple of seconds, they took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, and then they turned around and headed back down to town to tell the sheriff. And when the sheriff went up with his deputies to go search the scene themselves, they very quickly identified that these remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. And the sheriff also found out that that pistol that was found several feet away from the 2 skeletons had been purchased by Tom just a few days before he had vanished. And so the sheriff decided that what must have happened is Tom brought his dog up into the mountains, and after shooting his dog, Tom turned and shot himself. This was a suicide. Case closed. But this explanation didn't make any sense to the people of Silver Plume. First of all, Tom loved his dog Gus. Gus was basically like his child because Tom didn't have any other family. And so why would he hurt his dog? Also, Tom was not acting remotely like someone who was going to commit suicide in the days leading up to his death. People saw him at the grocery store buying a whole bunch of groceries. He talked endlessly about how excited he was about this big European vacation. And then there was this one other thing that also made suicide seem very unlikely. When those 2 hunters had discovered Tom and Gus, they were partially covered by that green plastic tarp, but it looked very much like the wind and kind of nature in general had blown the tarp off of them, revealing the white bones that the hunters had seen. But what that meant is that very likely that tarp at one point had been totally covering their bodies. And so between that and the fact that the gun was located several feet away from where Tom was, it seemed to the people of Silver Plume that probably somebody else had shot and killed both Tom and Gus, covered them up with this tarp, and then dumped the gun several feet away. Adding to the theory that this was a murder, not a suicide, were the rumors around town that there was this nuclear weapon production facility somewhere near their town, and apparently they were illegally dumping radioactive materials into these old abandoned mine shafts near and in Silver Plume. And people thought, maybe Tom, who had military training, he was actually in the special forces in the military, maybe he had gone out and done some snooping around and discovered this illegal dumping operation, and that got him killed. When Keith heard that Tom and Gus's bodies had been discovered up in the mountains, it was absolutely devastating for Keith. Even though Keith had never actually met Tom, he still felt like he had a bond with Tom. I mean, he was obsessively writing about Tom and learning everything about him, and he also had all these similarities with Tom, and so it was a really big deal to find out that Tom and Gus were dead. But the silver lining to this tragedy was that Keith was now armed with more information about Tom and his dog, and suddenly the ending to his big novel became clear. And so Keith got right back to work. On August 3rd, 1988, so a couple of days after Tom and Gus's skeletons were found up in the mountains, the town of Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service, because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment, and when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel, and he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. He was gonna get this book done. But he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he could finish this book. And that was, he had to go back up into the mountains. So a few days later, on August 7th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith walked inside of KP Cafe and strolled up to the counter where his buddy, Ted Parker, was sitting there reading a book. Keith paid for a drink and then announced to Ted that he, Keith, was going to leave this cafe and go right up into the mountains again. And so as Keith told Ted his big plan for this hike he was going to go on, Ted just felt totally confused. Ted's looking at Keith knowing this guy is not a confident climber. I mean, they had gone on that one hike partway up the mountain, and Keith had had a panic attack and had to go back down again. Also, at the top of the mountain, it was like 12,000 feet of elevation where the temperatures would be near or below freezing. And here Keith was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had no other equipment with him, no other warm clothes. Also, the route that Keith was describing to Ted would take at least 6 hours round trip. And it's 4:30 p.m. now. And so Ted's thinking, Keith is going to get trapped up in the mountains in the middle of the night. And so Ted finally says to Keith, "I hope you're joking." But Keith would say, "I am not joking. And in fact, I'm leaving right now." And then before Ted could even protest, Keith turned around and while sipping his drink, just casually walked out of the store and began heading towards the mountains. And Ted, he thought about stopping Keith and really talking some sense into him and getting him not to do this hike. But ultimately, Ted decided to do nothing, and he told himself that he would just check on Keith the next day. And so, the next morning, Ted, instead of going to his cafe, went first to the bookstore next door to see if Keith was in there. But when he got to the door, it was clear Keith was not inside, and the door was locked, and everything was dark. And so, trying not to panic, Ted hopped right back into his car, and he drove over to the church apartment where Keith had been staying. But again, Keith was not there. And right away, Ted is like, "Oh my goodness, Keith is stuck up on the mountain right now. Exactly what I thought was going to happen has happened." And so right away, Ted rushed to the sheriff to tell him that Keith was missing. And after hearing what Ted had to say, the sheriff would end up launching one of the biggest search and rescue efforts in the history of Colorado. Within 24 hours of being informed of Keith's absence, there were hundreds of people, professional searchers, and just locals who wanted to help, combing this mountain trail looking for Keith. There were planes overhead, there were tracking dogs. I mean, this was a really big deal. And by this point, Keith was very well known in Silver Plume. It's a tiny place. Everybody knows each other, and everyone knew that, he was working on this big book. And so people were really worried about Keith. He was one of theirs. But also, the townspeople were very creeped out by the fact that, Keith, who they knew was very similar to Tom, they knew he was writing about Tom, they knew that Keith was working out of the same storefront that Tom had been in, that now Keith had apparently vanished under the exact same circumstances as Tom. He had wandered into the woods, and that was it. And so it just felt like, how could they have these two people go missing in the exact same way? It just wasn't adding up. On August 9th, so 2 days after Keith had gone missing, and so by this point he's still missing, Ted and some friends decided they would go to Keith's apartment and look around and see if maybe there was some clue as to where Keith went or what he was going to do on this hike. And so they went into his apartment, and Ted's friends began fanning out and looking in the bedroom and looking through all the papers and documents all over the floor, and Ted sat down at Keith's computer. And so Ted fired it up. And as soon as it loaded, there was just this one document on the desktop, and it was the book that Keith was writing. And so Ted clicked on it. And right away, after reading just a couple of lines, he was yelling for his friends to come over here and look at this. And one by one, each of these guys came over, and they just could not believe what they were looking at. From the first page of Keith's book, it was clear the setting for his book was Silver Plume, except he renamed it White Plume. He had created all these fictional characters as well that were obviously based on real people, but had renamed them as well. But that was not what shocked Ted and his friends. What shocked them was the main character of this book. His name was Guy Gypsum. Guy Gypsum was a military veteran who had come to White Plume looking for a better life and an opportunity to be closer to nature in rural Colorado. Guy was almost 50 years old, he loved to go hiking, and he worked out of a storefront that was right next to the only cafe in town. Guy Gypsum was both Keith and Tom at the same time. Keith basically had taken Tom's life and Keith's own life and merged them to create this composite character. And when Ted and his friends scrolled to the bottom of this document, they realized that Keith had written an ending for Guy Gypsum's character. These are the final words in this document. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forests above. 5 days later, the search for Keith was called off. He was never found. Some people say Keith wandered up into the mountains and accidentally died of exposure, and someday we'll find his remains somewhere in the forest. But others say, after reading that final line in Keith's book, that Keith did all this on purpose. I mean, he literally lived out the final part of his book. He put on his boots and his heavy flannel shirt and his jeans, and he wandered off into the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above and killed himself in order to perhaps get closer to Tom Young, the man he had kind of become obsessed with after learning they were so similar, and the man he kind of like meshed his own life with and created this weird composite character of these two lives. I mean, it seemed like a guy that had kind of spiraled into madness in writing this book and decided that death was the only way to finish the novel. And still others say, maybe there really is some kind of secret illicit operation happening in or around Silver Plume. Maybe it's that radioactive waste getting dumped into the mines that, Tom discovered and that got him killed. And Keith, in researching Tom, also discovered this illegal thing and that got Keith killed as well. But all of those things are just theories because today, officially, there is no answer as to what happened to Keith. His case is still open.
In 2006, 73-year-old Sherman Sizemore was the definition of a man's man. He had spent the bulk of his adult life doing one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, mining for coal in West Virginia. And while he was a coal miner, he apparently had lost track of the amount of times he had nearly been killed from mine shaft collapse and gas leaks. Later on in life, after his kids had all grown up, he had retired from coal mining and become an ordained Baptist minister and
And despite his harrowing backstory and burly, intimidating appearance, he was known to be incredibly gentle and very calming to his parishioners. He was also known to be an incredibly devoted grandfather, to the point where if there was a chance to spend time with his grandkids, he would basically throw all of his responsibilities out the window to do that. But in January of that year, something changed in Sherman. He went from being this pillar in the community to being a deranged, paranoid lunatic. It all started on the afternoon of January 19th. Sherman and his wife Ruby were sitting in their home alone on the couch, just kind of doing their own things, when suddenly, out of the blue, Sherman just starts screaming as if he sees something in front of him that's terrifying him, and his scream startled Ruby so that she started screaming, and so she looks at her husband, and he's still just looking straight out ahead. He's terrified of something in front of him, and so Ruby looks from him to where he's looking, and there's nothing there. And so she turns back to her husband and she's like, "What's going on? What are you screaming for? What are you so scared of?" But Sherman wasn't able to speak. After he stopped screaming, he just continued to look straight out as if whatever had terrified him had him in this trance where he couldn't look away. And so his eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his face is going white, he's starting to sweat, and Ruby's starting to panic. She has no idea what's happening with him. And so eventually she just holds on to him and says, "Come back to me, come back to me." And Sherman at some point he kind of broke out of his trance. And he looked at his wife and he just says, "You can't leave me or they'll kill me." Ruby has never seen behavior like this in her husband ever. This is a completely different person she's interacting with. And so she has no idea what to do. And so instead, she just kind of holds on to Sherman and prays that he doesn't start acting like that again. But that didn't happen. All day long, periodically, he would just start screaming about something that Ruby couldn't see. Now, Ruby did consider calling 911 and getting medics out there, but his behavior was so unusual, and he was normally such a rock who was so competent, who was so healthy, that she didn't want to. She felt like he would just kind of get through this, that if they can just get through today and get into tomorrow, that he would be better. And so she just all day was comforting him and just dealing with these episodes. And then finally they got into bed that night, and Ruby's thinking, "Thank goodness, we're going to wake up tomorrow and things will be better." But when she woke up the next morning, it was very obvious Sherman had not slept at all. He was looking straight up at the ceiling. He looked worse than the day before. It was obvious that he was not back to normal. And so Ruby called the rest of the family and had them come over to figure out what they were going to do. But when Sherman found out his family was coming to his house, he told Ruby they can't come inside. He was afraid they and others were conspiring to bury him alive. The only person he could be around was Ruby, and his whole family had no idea what to do. Little did they know there was actually a very specific reason he was acting the way he was. A few months before January 19th, which was the day Sherman turned into this different person, a few months earlier, he began complaining of severe abdominal pains. And so he and his wife Ruby and his daughter, they went to the hospital, and the doctor, after examining him and running some tests, determined that most likely his pain was coming from his gallbladder. But the only way to be sure would be to do some exploratory surgery and literally look inside of Sherman's gut and look at his gallbladder and see if that was the problem. And so the doctor asked Sherman, "Are you prepared to do an exploratory surgery, or would you like to just kind of wait it out and see what happens with this pain?" And so Sherman talked it over with his wife and his family, and they made the decision that the pain was just too much, and so they would go forward with the surgery. And so on the morning of January 19th, so again, this is the day that Sherman basically loses his mind, he goes into the hospital completely normal. He goes in with his wife, he goes in with his daughter, and he makes his way over to the surgery wing of the hospital. He says bye to his family, and he's put on a stretcher bed, and he's wheeled in and prepped for surgery, and then brought into the operating room. And while he was in the operating room, laying on his stretcher bed, flat on his back, looking straight up at all these bright lights above him, he just struck up some chit-chat with the nurses and doctors who were in the room prepping the room for surgery, and they were also putting the IV into his arm. Then at some point, one of the nurses lowered the oxygen mask onto Sherman's face so the anesthesiologist could administer the 2-drug cocktail that would knock him out for the surgery. Sherman was scheduled to get something known as general anesthesia for this operation, where basically he would be completely out, he wouldn't feel anything, they'd do the surgery, and then he would wake up in recovery. And so once this mask was on Sherman's face, the anesthesiologist began pumping him full of the drugs that would make him be knocked out for the surgery. However, the anesthesiologist only administered one of the 2 drugs necessary for general anesthesia. He administered the paralyzing drug, but he did not administer the actual anesthetic that would knock him out, and most importantly, would get rid of all of his pain. And so as this mask is on his face and Sherman believes he's being given the proper dosage of drugs, the nurse who was nearby told Sherman to go ahead and start counting backwards in his head from 10, knowing full well that Sherman would pass out before he reached 0. And Sherman knew this too. He had been in surgery before, and so he happily began counting in his head. 10, 9, 8, he started to feel something. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Boom, he was out. Except he wasn't. When he reached 0 in his head, counting down, he realized he had not passed out. He began taking mental stock of what was going on, and he realized he could completely feel his body. But when he tried to move his body, he couldn't. He was completely paralyzed. When he tried to make a sound, he couldn't, because his vocal cords were also paralyzed. The only thing he could move were his eyes. He could move them left and right. However, they had taped his eyes shut, so he can't see anything. And so Sherman is thinking to himself, okay, I've been given the drugs, maybe they're slow acting, any minute now I'm going to drift off to sleep and this will just be a distant memory. But after a few seconds, he's hearing the doctors and nurses in the room. He can't see them, but he hears them. They seem to be moving towards doing this operation, and he's still awake. And so Sherman becomes frantic and starts flicking his eyes left and right as fast as he possibly can. And the rapid eye movement actually loosened the tape on both of his eyelids, and it created a tiny slit that he could actually look through. And what he saw terrified him. The surgeon was walking over next to him. He was getting his gloves on. And then the surgeon says, "Scalpel." And the nurse hands him this chrome metallic blade, and the surgeon takes the blade and begins cutting into Sherman's midsection. Sherman felt everything, but Sherman couldn't do anything about it. All he could do was rapidly flick his eyes left and right in hopes one of them would see that he was awake, that he was feeling this. But no one was paying attention to his face, so they didn't see his eyes moving around. And so the surgeon continued to cut into his midsection until he had cut out a fairly significantly sized hole, at which point the surgeon hands the scalpel to the nurse and says, "Clamps," at which point the nurse hands him what looks like a torture device, and the surgeon proceeds to use these clamps to pin segments of Sherman's skin that has just been cut open to his body to basically keep the hole open. And then the surgeon began tugging on the outsides of this hole in Sherman's midsection, making sure it was big enough that he could actually get a good look into his body. And every little tug is sending lightning bolts of pain into Sherman's body. But again, all he can do is flick his eyes left and right, and no one's paying attention. "Scope," the surgeon called out for, and the nurse handed him a camera that he jammed into Sherman's gut. And then the surgeon said, "Suction," and the nurse got what looked like a vacuum and pressed it inside of this open wound and began sucking out fluids from his body. The pain Sherman was experiencing is unimaginable. Every second felt like an eternity. "Forceps," the surgeon called, and the nurse handed him these metal prongs that he put inside of this hole in Sherman's body, and he used them to dislodge his gallbladder so he could get a better look at it. By this point, Sherman wanted to die. He was no longer flicking his eyes left and right. He was just looking straight out, hoping someone would finally see him. And someone did. One of the nurses standing next to the surgeon looked up at Sherman's face and saw Sherman looking back, terrified at the nurse, at which point the nurse yelled out, "Stop, he's awake, he's awake!" And the surgeon practically faints, and he looks over at the anesthesiologist and he calls him, "Get over here and fix this." And so the anesthesiologist comes running over from the side of the room. He gets up next to Sherman and begins pumping him full of painkillers. And as he's doing this, he has this moment of clarity. He remembers he didn't give him the anesthetic. And so as these new painkillers that have just been introduced begin to take their effect, Sherman's eyes go from being terrified to glazed over, and he does pass off to sleep. And so now he's out and he can't feel anything. But now the anesthesiologist and the medical team realize they have a very big problem. This patient just experienced 16 minutes of surgery and felt all of it. And at the end of it, when he wakes up, he's going to remember it, and he's probably going to file a lawsuit against the hospital. And so a decision was made. It's unclear if the anesthesiologist acted alone or if the entire team was in on this, but regardless, the anesthesiologist administered an additional drug after giving all these painkillers. This additional drug was called midazolam, but it's better known as the amnesia drug. And like its nickname implies, anyone who gets it will forget what has just happened to them. And so the idea was by giving him this amnesia drug, he won't remember the trauma he had suffered through during during the surgery, and so wouldn't file a lawsuit. And so after he was given this drug, the medical team, they went back to doing the surgery, they completed it, and they got him back out to recovery. And then when Sherman woke up in recovery, he did not remember what had happened to him inside of the operating room, at least not consciously. Those horrible 16 minutes had been implanted on Sherman's subconscious. Basically, his body recognized that he had experienced extreme trauma. However, the amnesia drug wiped away the memory of how he received that trauma. So there's this big disconnect in his memory. And so when Sherman came to in the recovery room, he immediately sensed something was horribly, horribly wrong. He was scared, he was anxious, he had this incredible sense of dread, but he had no memory to tie these feelings to. And so as Sherman is sitting in recovery, he must have tried to kind of hide the way he was feeling because he didn't even remotely understand it. He had been completely happy and normal going into the surgery, and now a couple of hours later, he's a complete mess. And so he leaves the hospital that day on January 19th. He goes back to his house and he sits on the couch with his wife. And as he's sitting there, suddenly these horrible feelings he's having, they become too much. And he basically has a panic attack and he starts screaming out and he's terrified of something, but he doesn't know what it is. And then over the next couple of days, he began having these flashbacks where he would access the actual 16 minutes of torture he went through. But when he would see someone cutting into him and opening his chest up and sucking things out of it, he didn't think that happened to me and that's why I feel this way. Instead, he thought it was just this horrible nightmare that he couldn't escape from. And so his family did eventually start getting doctors and psychologists and all these people involved to figure out what was wrong with him. But before they could figure it out, the whole situation had just become too terrible for Sherman. And so on February 2nd, just 2 weeks after he came out of that surgery, he would take his own life. His family was unbelievably heartbroken. It didn't seem real that this had happened. And so they would continue to dig and figure out what went wrong. And they would finally get their hands on the medical report from the gallbladder exploratory surgery on January 19th. And after giving it to another doctor to look over, this doctor discovered that Sherman had in fact experienced 16 minutes of something known as anesthesia awareness, where you are awake or feel a portion of your surgery. And shockingly, this happens to 20,000 people a year. However, Sherman's case, forgetting the amnesia drug, just literally what he went through, 16 full minutes of this really intensive surgery that he felt, that is an absolute rarity. That does not happen very often. Sherman's family would go on to sue the hospital, and they would be awarded an undisclosed amount of money from the hospital in 2008.
On the evening of June 28, 1997, an 83-year-old woman named Leila Howard turned up the radio in the living room of her small home in Texas, and then she took a seat next to her husband, Raymond, on the couch. This was a song that both of them loved, and in the past, Leila knew her husband would have swooped her up and begun dancing with her right away. But Raymond was now 88 years old, he was also recovering from brain surgery, and they both were planning to go to bed in the next few minutes because they had a big day the next day.
They were going to go to the Pioneer Day Music Festival, which is an annual fiddling festival located about 15 miles away from where Leela and Raymond lived, in the town of Salado, Texas. Leela and Raymond attended this festival basically every year. And so even though Raymond right now was a bit fragile from his surgery and his advanced age, the couple had not even considered missing it. Leela's son, Hal, had tried to persuade Leela to let him, Hal, drive the couple to the music festival, but Leela said no because Leela and Raymond were both fiercely independent and wanted to be in control of their lives, which included driving to and from this festival. Also, Leela had talked about maybe going someplace else after the festival ended with Raymond, kind of spontaneously just driving out and doing something, and so she really wanted to have her own car in case she did want to do that. And so after a few minutes, Leela and Raymond's favorite song came to an end, and the DJ hopped back on the radio and began talking about the weather and the traffic, and at that point, Raymond and Leela, they stood up from the couch, they took each other's hands, and they walked upstairs to go to bed. The next morning, so June 29th, Leela and Raymond walked out the front door of their house, and they walked down to their driveway where their Oldsmobile car was parked. Leela helped Raymond get into the passenger seat, and then Leela took her spot in the driver's seat. And then a few moments later, after they were all buckled in and situated, Leela fired up the car, backed out the driveway, and began driving. That evening, Leela's son, Hal, decided to swing by Leela and Raymond's house to check in on them and see how the festival went. And so at about 5 p.m., Hal got to their house, and right away when he pulled up, he noticed that Leela and Raymond's car, the Oldsmobile, was not in the driveway. And so Hal thought that was pretty odd because by now they should have been back from the festival. In years past, they would always get home by about 3 p.m. at the absolute latest because they didn't like staying out late, and so it just seemed odd that they were not back by now. But at the same time, Hal knew that Leela had been thinking about maybe going out and doing something spontaneous after the event was over. And so he thought, maybe his mom and Raymond were out driving around somewhere and they'd be back later. But just for good measure, Hal did park the car and he walked up to the front door of the house and he did knock. But when there was no answer, he thought, you know what, I'll just go home and come back in a few hours and check in on them at that point. And so, a few hours later, at 8 p.m., Hal drove back to Leela and Raymond's house, and when he got there, he saw their car was still not back yet. And so now Hal's starting to feel pretty worried, and so he parked the car, he walked up to the front door, he did knock, there was no answer, and so he pulled out his set of keys, he opened up the door, and he walked inside. Now, as soon as he was in the house, nothing looked out of place. It actually looked very organized and clean like it normally was. But as he walked around looking for some sign of where Leela and Raymond were, all he could find was on one of the beds there were all these neat stacks of clothes that were laid out as if somebody was getting ready to pack but didn't finish packing. And so it just seemed like something's off here, something's not right. This doesn't seem like they just went out and did something spontaneous. Something must have happened at the festival. That's why they're not back yet. And so kind of in a panic, Hal ran outside and he called the police. And after reporting Leela and Raymond missing, he actually began calling news stations and telling them, can you please put out my mom and Raymond's picture because they're older and they're missing. I need your help. And in fact, that night, those TV stations did begin putting out all these reports about how Leela and Raymond were missing and for people to be on the lookout for them and their car. At the same time, the police immediately launched an investigation, and they quickly discovered that Leela and Raymond had never even made it to the music festival. They never got there. And then when the police drove the route that Leela would have taken to get to the music festival, they didn't find any car accidents or anything unusual on the route that would indicate that they got into some trouble or something. They checked their phone records, and Leela and Raymond had called nobody. There was no action on their credit cards, and so they hadn't bought anything. And the police would send out all these missing person reports to police officers all over the state of Texas, and nobody reported seeing anything or hearing anything. That is, until 3 days later on July 2nd. On that night, a police officer in a little town in Arkansas, located 500 miles away from where Leela and Raymond lived, this police officer was driving down the road when he spotted an Oldsmobile that was driving with its lights off. And so the officer pulled the car over and he ran the license plate and it came back as belonging to Leela and Raymond. But you got to remember that this police officer was in Arkansas, and so he had not received any updates about this missing couple. All those TV broadcasts and all the missing person alerts that were getting sent out all over the place, those were really only happening in the state of Texas. And so this officer has no clue that Leela and Raymond are missing. But he runs the plate, he sees it belongs to Leela and Raymond, and he goes up to the driver's side window, and he looks inside, and he sees Leela and Raymond. Leela's driving, Raymond's in the passenger seat, and they look like a really happy older couple. And the officer would say to Leela, hey, you're driving with your lights off. And Leela would say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. You know, we were driving in Texas, and we got lost, and I just didn't notice. I'm really sorry. The officer believed her and felt like these were good people who just made an honest mistake. And so he just flicked her lights on and said, I'm going to give you a warning. No big deal, no ticket, but be careful with your lights. You got to make sure those are on at night. And Leela said, thank you very much. Of course, I'll be very careful with my lights. And then actually the officer gave Leela directions on how to get back to Texas from Arkansas. And then he got back in his cruiser, and then he watched as Leela and Raymond pulled onto the main road and then disappeared into the darkness. The police officer in Arkansas who pulled them over would eventually put it together who he had pulled over, and at that point, Arkansas would get in on the search for Leela and Raymond. But for the next 2 weeks, despite having both states aggressively searching for this couple, nobody could find them. That is until July 12th, so that's 10 days after Leela and Raymond got pulled over by that cop in Arkansas. On that day, these two young boys were walking by a small stream in a town called Hot Springs, Arkansas, when they began to smell a terrible smell. They would end up telling their parents, who would come back to the stream, and they'd smell it too, and they would end up alerting the police, and the police would come out, and they would search that entire area, and they would find Leela and Raymond's Oldsmobile at the base of a 25-foot cliff, and inside the vehicle were Leela and Raymond, and they were both deceased. It looked very much like Leela and Raymond had driven off this cliff and they had landed down below, and that's what killed them. But when investigators went up to the top of that cliff, there were no skid marks on the cliff itself, which meant Leela, who was driving, never hit the brakes as she went over the cliff. Nobody knows why Leela and Raymond abruptly left their town and drove hundreds of miles into Arkansas instead of going to their favorite music festival, although their family members have speculated that it could be because Leela and Raymond had declining cognitive function, and so they basically didn't know what was going on, and that's why it happened. But the reason this story is in this video is because this story about Leela and Raymond is what inspired a very, very famous song from the late 1990s. It's called The Way by Fastball, and for copyright reasons, we can't play it for you, but I'll sing you a line and see if you can remember this song. But where were they going without ever knowing the way? Anyone can see the road that they walk on is paved in gold. It's always summer, you'll never get cold. You'll never be hungry, you'll never be old and gray. Boom, there you go. If you know the song, now you know it's got a pretty intense backstory.